The sea at Brighton lay grey and restless beneath a low autumn sky, and the wind carried the taste of salt across the long chalk cliffs. Gaslight flickered in the tall windows of the promenade, and the smell of coal smoke drifted through streets still wet from the morning rain. Inside a small sweet shop on West Street, glass jars stood in neat rows, and their bright drops glowed amber and rose under the low lamps. A gloved hand moved slowly along the counter, gathering chocolate creams into a paper twist tied with pale string. Outside, a child ran past in the wet stones, laughing into the salt wind. The bell above the door gave a soft, uneven ring as the woman stepped out into the fog, and no one in Brighton yet knew that the sweetness in her hand was already touched with quiet death. The salt and the smoke of Brighton. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, and the night has grown long enough to sit with quieter voices. If you have found this place tonight, take a moment to tell the darkness where you are. Perhaps a small kitchen in a northern town. Perhaps a bedroom high in a city that never truly sleeps. Perhaps a chair beside a window where the rain has been drawing lines against the glass for hours. And let the hour on your side of the world be known only to you and to the stillness. It helps this small candle to burn a little longer when kind listeners choose to follow along. So if the voice you hear tonight brings you any comfort, a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft moment given to like or share the video would help this quiet channel find the next listener who needs a story to fall asleep to. Now settle back, let the pillows soften, and let the years slip away from beneath your feet, because tonight we are drifting to the south coast of England, into a winter that has already forgotten us, and into a town whose gas lamps still burn in the memory of the sea. The town of Brighton sits low against the water, held between the long white cliffs and the wide grey channel, and its shoreline has been shaped for centuries by the patient scraping of the tide. In the year 1870, and into the year that followed, the sea kept its old habits, rising cold and heavy in the winter mornings, and falling back at evening into a colour close to slate. The wind came in off the water almost every day, carrying the smell of salt and wet rope, and it moved down every street of the town, from the fine white terraces above to the narrow lanes that fell toward the harbour. Above the town, the chalk of the South Downs rose in slow, pale curves, and on clear days the light struck them so plainly that the whole coast seemed drawn against a sheet of soft, worn linen. The promenade ran along the front of the sea like a long, careful sentence written in stone, and its iron railing stood black and firm against the spray. On winter afternoons, gentlemen in dark coats walked its length with their hands clasped behind their backs, and ladies in heavy skirts of grey and violet moved slowly beside them, their bonnets tied close beneath their chins. The wheels of small carriages rolled along the road behind them, and the horses stamped and steamed in the cold, their harness bells giving off small, tired sounds. Bath chairs pushed by patient attendants carried the frailer visitors along the seafront, and the men and women wrapped beneath their blankets watched the water with pale, distant eyes. The pier stretched out into the channel on tall iron legs, and beneath it the waves moved in dark folds that never quite settled into a pattern. Brighton in this century wore two faces at once, and both of them were painted with great care, and the face turned toward the sea was elegant, ordered and confident, with its long white crescents of townhouse terraces, its bow windows, its stone balconies, and its slow parade of gentle visitors seeking the salt air the doctors had promised would cure them. The face turned inward, away from the promenade, was crowded and darker with its narrow courts, its washing hung between windows, and its small children playing in the wet stones of streets whose names most visitors never learned. Both faces belonged to the same body of a town, and both were breathing the same fog, and both were lit at nightfall by the same slow flowering of gaslight along every wall and every corner. The gas lamps of Brighton were among the great quiet marvels of the age, and by this year they were as common in the town as the church bells. At dusk, the lamplighter walked his familiar route with his long pole, and one by one the small blue flames sprang into life along the promenade, along the shopping streets, along the sea road, and along the higher terraces above. Their light was thin and yellow and unsteady, and it did not so much banish the darkness as arrange it into softer shapes. The mist that came off the water at evening drifted through the pools of that light in slow, curling ribbons, and it turned every doorway into a small stage on which passing figures appeared and disappeared without warning. The smell of the town was as layered as its light, and on the promenade there was the clean, cold breath of the sea itself, mixed with the tang of tar from the fishing boats and the sharp, sour note of seaweed drying on the shingle. Move inland only a street or two, and coal smoke settled thickly over everything, curling from chimneys of every height, from the tall stacks of the hotels down to the small pots of the servant lodgings. Nearer the market lanes, the smell became a stronger thing, thick with horse dung and wet hay and the iron scent of fresh meat hanging in the butcher's windows. And above it all drifted, at unexpected moments, the sudden warm sweetness of a bakery door opening onto the cold. Brighton had learned, in its way, to keep its perfumes and its stinks in careful balance, and its citizens moved through the mixture without seeming to notice which was which. The people of the town belonged to a strict and quiet order, and every street knew its own place inside that order. In the great terraces on the seafront lived the retired officers, the widowed ladies of good families, and the visitors from London who took long rooms for the winter and paid their rent in polite silence. Their households were run by cooks, by parlour-maids, by boot-boys and by nursemaids, and these servants moved between the upper rooms and the lower rooms by narrow back stairs that guests never saw. In the smaller streets behind the promenade, the shopkeepers lived above their own shops, and the fishermen kept lodgings close to their nets, and the labourers who paved the roads and mended the roofs kept their families packed into single rooms above workshops that had no chimney of their own. Every class kept its own hours, its own manners, and its own doorway, and each doorway was watched from behind lace curtains by neighbours who knew, or believed they knew, every step taken along the street. The trades of Brighton were as varied as its faces, and doctors held rooms along Grand Parade and Old Stein, and their brass plates gleamed dully in the sea light, promising cures for weak lungs, weak nerves, and the general grey weariness. The century called melancholia. Chemists kept dim little shops, whose shelves were lined with glass jars of coloured powders and bottled tinctures, and behind their counters were small drawers holding poisons that could be sold with a signature and a nod, for the killing of vermin, or for the developing of photographs, or for uses the customer did not need to name aloud. Confectioners kept the sunniest windows in the town, with tall glass jars of boiled sweets in every colour, and slabs of chocolate cream stacked in careful pyramids under the gaslight. Every trade seemed to serve the same slow ritual, which was the passing of small parcels from clean-gloved hands into other clean-gloved hands, across polite counters, in the language of please and thank you and good day. The century that held this town was a century in love with its own manners, and letters were written on thick paper and folded with great care, and they were carried through the streets by postmen in dark uniforms, who walked their rounds many times a day. A parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with pale string could travel the length of the town in an hour, moving from a small shop into the gloved hands of a servant girl, and from her into the hands of a lady in a drawing-room above. Nothing in Brighton was thought too small to be sent, and no gift was thought too plain to be offered, and no offering was thought suspicious, so long as the paper was clean and the string was neatly tied. The postman was a familiar figure at every door, and no one yet feared the sound of his boots on their steps. The churches of the town kept the hours of the century in the plain, common way, and their bells rang for morning service and again for evening prayer, and the Sunday streets emptied into their pews and filled again when the doors opened at noon. The vicars preached on the wages of sin and on the mercies of Providence, and the congregations bowed their heads and nodded gently, and the servant girls in the back rows kept their eyes down and their bonnets straight. Faith in this century did not sit apart from daily life. It was woven through every hour, from the grace whispered before bread to the last prayer breathed against a pillow at night. It was believed, without argument, that God saw every action of every soul in Brighton, and that the wicked in the end would meet their reckoning either in this world or the next. Medicine, too, wore the same slow certainty, and the doctors of Brighton belonged to a class of men who believed themselves the guardians of both body and reputation, and their consulting rooms were furnished with heavy curtains, dark wood, and glass-fronted cabinets that held polished instruments and soft velvet trays. A physician's word could quiet a scandal, calm a nervous relative, or write a certificate that closed a coffin without further questions. The town trusted its doctors, and the doctors, for their part, learned the private secrets of 100 households and kept them safely folded away in leather notebooks that no wife or husband ever saw. In this way, the little sorrows of the town were handled with dignity, and its small madnesses were tucked back inside their drawing-rooms before the neighbours could take notice. Above all this settled ritual moved the weather, which in Brighton was rarely still. Rain arrived without warning on a soft eastern wind, and it drew long silver lines against every window in the town, and it darkened the chalk cliffs to a deep bruised grey. Sea fog rolled in on quiet mornings and turned the pier into a grey ghost floating on white water, and even the tallest hotels lost their upper stories inside it. Snow, when it fell, was thin and reluctant, and it lay only a few hours upon the roofs before the salt air ate it away, and when the sky cleared, as it sometimes did in the early afternoons, the light over the channel was the pale, bright silver of an old mirror, and the whole town glowed for an hour in a colour that no other coast in England could quite match. Beneath the promenade on the shingle beach, the fishing boats lay drawn up on their sides in long dark rows. The fishermen mended their nets in the cold air with fingers cracked open by salt, and their small oil lamps burned yellow inside the black timbers of their sheds. Their children ran barefoot along the pebbles even in winter, gathering scraps of wood driven in by the tide, and their mothers called them home before the dark closed in. This shore had fed the town for hundreds of years before the grand terraces were ever raised above it, and its rhythm of tide and net and evening lamp had never truly changed. The elegant town above and the working shore below shared the same wind, and often the same rain, and always the same slow gathering fog. Inland, beyond the theatres and the assembly rooms, the town rose in gentle streets toward the higher ground, and in these upper streets stood the fine houses of the professional classes, of retired officers and their wives and unmarried daughters, whose front doors wore polished brass and whose windows carried lace curtains held back with pale silk cords, and inside whose drawing rooms the fires burned low against the winter afternoons. In these rooms tea was poured at 4, letters were opened and read aloud, and small china plates of biscuits and chocolate creams were passed slowly from hand to hand. The visitors of the afternoon came and went in dark coats and heavy skirts, and their conversation moved in the safe patterns their century had taught them, touching upon the weather, upon the health of an aged aunt, upon the sermon of the previous Sunday, and never upon the darker griefs each of them carried home unspoken. In one such room, on one such afternoon, a maid crossed a polished floor with a small silver tray, and the china cups rattled softly on their saucers, and the velvet curtain by the window was drawn a little further back against the gathering fog outside. A daughter of the Genteel class. Some 60 miles east of Brighton, along the same restless English coast, lies the older town of Margate, and it was here, in a house of pale stone above the harbour, that the Edmunds family had first taken its shape. The town sat on a chalk headland much like Brighton itself, and its beach was cut into wide flats by the falling tide, and its little jetty ran out into the grey mouth of the Thames, where it emptied at last into the northern sea. Fishing smacks drew up their sails at the harbour wall, and their brown canvas caught the wind as it turned in off the water, and gulls wheeled above the roofs in long, slow arcs from morning to nightfall. The streets rose from the shore in narrow terraces, and the houses wore stucco fronts painted a soft cream that the salt had already begun to eat, and the small windows above the doors caught the sun for a few thin hours before the fog moved in again from the east. This was the town in which William Edmunds had built his name, and his profession was that of an architect, and his hand had drawn the plans of streets and villas and the tall white lighthouse that stood watch over the pier. William Edmunds was a man of the professional class, and his rooms were furnished in the manner his class expected, with a large writing desk of dark mahogany beneath the window, and shelves of leather books along one wall, and a case of drawing instruments laid out in a lined tray beside his elbow. His wife was Christiana Edmunds, a woman of quiet manners and firm bearing, and she kept the household in the careful way of the century, with linen counted twice a year, with silver polished on the same Thursday of every month, and with the children taken in fresh clothes to church on Sunday mornings. Their marriage had begun with hope, and the drawing-rooms of Margate had received them warmly, and the visits and letters and small teas that measured out the social life of the town had welcomed the young family into the folds of its respectability. 5 children in time were born to them, and the eldest of these was a daughter given the name Christiana, after her mother, and she came into the world in the year 1828 in an upstairs room above the harbour, while the tide moved in below the window. The children of the Edmunds household grew inside a life of tidy comforts and quiet expectations, and they wore the long white cotton frocks that Victorian daughters wore in their earliest years, and they were taught their letters at a small oak table by a governess brought down from London in the summer months. There were prayers before breakfast, and a walk along the front at 11, and lessons in French and in fine sewing, and small dishes of milk pudding at tea. The boys were sent in time to schoolrooms with tall windows, where they copied out passages from Latin books and stood at slates to work sums. and the girls were kept at home and taught the household arts that the century measured as their proper inheritance. Christiana, the eldest daughter, was said to be a girl of neat handwriting and careful drawing, and she was sometimes given her father's rulers to hold when he unrolled his great sheets of paper on the study floor, and she watched the pencil lines of streets and buildings spread out under his fingers, as though he were pulling a whole small town out of the paper itself. For a time, the family lived inside the picture their century approved, and the outside of the house was polished, and the inside of the house was warm, and the visitors were shown into the drawing-room and offered tea from a silver pot, and no one who called at the front door had any reason to think that a shadow already lay quietly at work behind the panelled walls. That shadow was old, and it belonged not to Margate alone, but to the Edmunds line itself, and it moved through the blood of the family in the slow, unnoticed way that inherited sorrows moved through the great houses of the age. It was the sickness the century called by 100 careful names, and doctors of the day spoke of it as melancholia, or as brain fever, or as a weakness of the nerves, and the family called it, when it was spoken of at all, only a delicate condition, and even then only in whispers behind a closed drawing-room door. In the private letters of relatives, and in the diaries kept in locked drawers, this shadow moved from father to son and from mother to daughter, and it was not spoken of in public, and it was not confessed even between cousins, and it was never written down where a servant might see. William Edmunds began, in the years after Christiana's birth, to feel the reaching hand of that shadow upon himself, and it came to him first in slow moods that fell without warning across his mornings, and it came again in strange fits of weeping that broke over him at his own desk, and it came at last in longer silences from which no gentle question could draw him out. His hand began to shake upon the drawing rulers, and the fine straight lines of his plans began to waver a little, where before they had been firm, and his colleagues in the town, who were kind men, quietly took over the more careful of his commissions, and left him only the small ones. There were days when he did not rise from his bed, and there were nights when he wandered the passages of the house holding a candle and speaking to no one, and the servants learned to keep their doors closed and their footsteps light. His wife Anne Christiana kept her hands folded in her lap in the afternoons, and she did not weep in front of the children, and she wrote letters to her sisters in careful, even lines that gave nothing away. The disease grew heavier upon him with each passing year, and it took away first his work, and then his social visits, and then his appetite for the meals set out before him at the long table, and at last it took his reason itself. In the year 1843, when Christiana was 15 years old, the family found itself no longer able to hold him within the walls of the Margate house, and the decision was made, in that careful, closed-door manner the century preferred, that he must be sent away for what the doctors called his own protection. He was carried in a private carriage to a place called Peckham House, which was one of the private asylums that stood in the quieter parts of the country outside London, and the gates closed behind him without ceremony, and he did not return. 4 years later, in a room he did not know, in a house he had never designed, William Edmunds died at the age of 46, and his death certificate was signed by an asylum physician, and the family in Margate received the news in the same envelope that carried the small bill of the burial charges. The blow fell hard upon the household, and it fell harder still because it was not the only blow that would come. In the same slow years, other members of the Edmunds line began to show the same signs, and an uncle followed William into the walls of a private asylum, and cousins in other counties were kept quietly at home, behind curtained windows, and the small deaths of infants in the family were spoken of only as failures of the constitution, and no doctor was pressed for a plainer word. The eldest son of William and Anne, a boy named Frederick, grew tall and dark-eyed in the years after his father's death, and he showed at first only the ordinary temper of a young man, and then, as the years turned, he began to fall into the same shaking fits that had marked his father's later evenings. He was placed under private care, and his sisters were told very little, and when he died before the age of 25 it was said within the family that his heart had failed, and the true cause was folded into a letter that never left the writing desk. Christiana herself, in these years of losses and closed doors, grew from a girl into a young woman inside a household that had lost its lightness. The lamps of the drawing-room burned as before, and the tea was still poured at 4 in the afternoon, and the linen was still counted twice a year in the linen press upstairs, but the piano stood untouched for months at a time, and the visitors came less often, and the small parties that once filled the front rooms with candlelight and quiet laughter no longer took their place upon the calendar. Anne Christiana Byrne wore black for her husband, and she wore black again for her son, and she began at last to wear the plain colours of long mourning even on the days when no fresh grief called for them. As surviving daughters, and Christiana chief among them, moved through the house in the same careful hush, and their girlhoods were furnished with more silence than song, and their days were kept full of small stitching, and of quiet reading, and of the little charitable errands the century approved for daughters of their class. Christiana, in her 20s, was said by those who called at the house to be a young woman of pleasant appearance, with dark hair drawn plainly back, and pale eyes that met the visitor a moment too long before returning to the carpet. She was thought clever, and she was thought accomplished at the small arts. A lady was expected to master, and she was thought sensitive of feeling, which in that century was both a compliment and a very quiet warning. She was not married, and no engagement was announced in the columns of the local paper, and the years slipped by, and her mother's letters to distant relatives began to describe her in careful phrases as devoted to the home. What could not be written in those letters, and what could not be said aloud at the tea-table, was that the family had by now learned to watch its own children for the first stirrings of the shadow, and that Christiana, in the small nervous habits of her hands, and in the long moods that came upon her without cause, gave those who loved her more reason to watch than her sisters did. The world outside the house did not, for the most part, know these private fears, and the census-takers who came to the door in the middle of the century wrote down the names of the household in their neat columns, and they gave the family the polite word of independent means, and they moved on to the next door. To their neighbours, the Edmunds women were only two more of the many quiet widowed households scattered along the south coast of England, in which a mother in mourning and her unmarried daughters lived out their days on the modest income left by a departed husband. This was a common shape of household in the age, and few thought it strange, and fewer still asked what illnesses might have taken the father, and no one at all inquired into the temperature of the daughter's mind. So long as the front step was scrubbed clean, and the calling cards were left on the silver tray by the door, and the church pew was filled on Sunday mornings, the town saw only what it wished to see. In the year 1867, Anne Christiana Byrne made the decision that the family would leave the eastern coast behind, and that a new address would be taken on the southern one, and the household was gathered up out of its old rooms and packed into the wooden trunks and hat boxes and travelling cases the century used for such moves. The furniture was sent ahead by carrier, and the servants were paid off or brought along as the case required, and the mother and her elder unmarried daughter took the train down through the green weald of Kent, and westward at last to Brighton on the Channel coast. Their new lodgings were rooms in a boarding establishment on Gloucester Place, kept by a landlady who took in respectable widows and their grown daughters as her chosen trade. The rooms were furnished in the plain, comfortable way. Such houses always were, with a heavy round table beneath the window, and a black horsehair sofa against one wall, and a small coal fire that burned all afternoon in the grate. Brighton in these years was a town given over to visitors, and to invalids, and to those who had come to breathe its salt air on the advice of the physician somewhere further north. It was a town of doctors and druggists and confectioners and small circulating libraries, and it was a town of lodging-houses in which mothers and daughters passed the afternoons in one another's company without ever quite filling the hours. The promenade lay only a few streets away from the new address, and Christiana walked its length in the winter mornings with her mother upon her arm, and her plain dark bonnet was tied close beneath her chin, and her gloved hands were folded quietly at her waist. She was nearly 40 years old, and she was unmarried, and she had watched a father and a brother taken away in turn by the same slow sickness her own century did not know how to name, and now she walked the shingle path above the sea, in a town that knew nothing of her at all. In the small drawing-room of the boarding establishment, tea was set out at 4 in the afternoon, and the landlady moved between her lodgers with the polite hush of her trade, and the coal shifted quietly in the grate as the winter light thinned along the wall. Christiana Edmunds took her cup in a gloved hand, and the steam rose thin and slow into the cool sea air of the room, and outside the tall window the gaslight was just beginning its low, uncertain flowering along the wet stones of the street. The doctor on Grand Parade. The street called Grand Parade ran along the eastern side of the old part of Brighton, and it faced the wide green space of the Stein, and it carried in its long line of pale terraces the settled dignity of the professional men who kept their rooms behind its polished doors. The pavement was laid in broad flags of grey stone, and the railings were of iron painted black, and the tall front windows caught the low winter light of the sea in long, quiet panels. Carriages moved along the road at a slow pace in the middle hours of the day, and the sound of their wheels upon the stones came in soft and steady into the rooms behind the glass. Above every door, a brass plate had been fixed at the height of a gloved hand, and each plate carried, in the small deep letters of the age, the name of a man of medicine or of law. At number 64 the plate carried the name of Dr. Charles Beard, and beneath it a smaller line of letters set out his qualifications in the careful phrases the age preferred. The consulting room behind that door was a place of dark wood and warm lamps, and its curtains were of heavy green velvet drawn back with plaited cords of pale silk. A desk of mahogany stood beneath the window, and upon it were laid a leather blotter, a stand of pens, an inkwell of clear glass, and a small brass bell that summoned the housekeeper from her rooms below. Along one wall stood a tall cabinet in which polished instruments were laid out upon soft blue velvet, and their steel gave off a low cold shine even in the yellow light of the fire. On another wall hung a painting of Dr. Beard's own father, a physician of an earlier decade, shown in dark oils with a book of anatomy resting upon his knee. The carpet was of a deep red, woven with a pattern of small flowers, and it took the small sounds of the room and softened them into a hush that seemed to fold itself around the shoulders of every visitor. Dr. Charles Beard was a man in his middle years, tall and lean in his build, with dark hair kept neatly parted at the side, and a beard trimmed close to the jaw in the fashion of his calling. His coat was of dark grey wool cut in the sober line of the medical class, and his linen was fresh each morning, and the small gold chain of his watch crossed the front of his waistcoat in the manner all doctors of the town wore. He held his papers from London, and he had trained in the wards of a great hospital there, and he had come down to Brighton in the years of his young married life to build a practice among the elder ladies and the frail visitors who filled the boarding-houses of the town. His hands were long and clean and steady, and he was known among his patients for the low, even voice with which he took a history and for the careful writing with which he set down every small complaint in a leather notebook, kept always at his elbow. The household of Dr. Beard stood a few streets away in a tall stucco house of the same period, and it was kept by his wife Emily, a young woman of gentle bearing whose family had been church people in a country parish of the Midlands. Emily Beard bore her husband several children, and she managed her nursery and her drawing-room with the quiet skill her upbringing had taught her, and her tea-table on the visiting afternoons was known among the doctors' wives of the town for the plainness of its china and the warmth of its welcome. The house had a small back garden with a walnut tree at its centre, and the children played beneath its branches on the fair days, and the black iron gate at the side of the house opened onto a lane that ran quietly behind the terraces. Into this household, in the closing months of the 1860s, a new name began to enter with a regularity that no one at first thought worth remark, and that name was the name of Miss Christiana Edmunds. She had first come to the consulting room on grand parade in the ordinary way of any lady of her class, and she had come upon the arm of her mother, and she had described to the doctor, in the low, careful voice she kept for such rooms, the small troubles that had gathered around her nerves since her arrival on the coast. She spoke of a heaviness that fell across her mornings without warning, and of a fluttering in the chest that came upon her in company, and of long nights in which sleep would not settle upon her, and the sea outside seemed to sound too clearly against the walls of her lodging. She spoke of headaches that arrived at dusk and stayed through the small hours, and of a strange unease in the light of the drawing-room lamps, and of dreams that left her weeping in the pale grey light of the winter dawns. Dr. Beard listened to her with the calm attention his profession required, and he wrote in his leather book, and he set out for her, on that first visit, the mild remedies his age offered for such troubles of the female nerves. She returned to his consulting room again, and the pattern of her visits fell into a rhythm through the winter months, and her mother came with her at first, and then, in the small way such things drifted in that age, her mother began to remain behind in the lodgings on Gloucester Place, while the daughter walked the short distance to Grand Parade alone. The winter streets were cold along her route, and the wind moved in off the sea across the wide grass of the Stein, and the gulls turned above the roofs of the terraces with slow, patient wings. The Dops's housekeeper opened a door to her at the appointed hour, and she was shown along the panelled hall into the consulting room, and she took her seat upon the small upright chair that faced the mahogany desk, and she folded her gloved hands into her lap in the manner she had been taught in her girlhood. The room was always warm, and the fire was always low, and the doctor's voice was always even, and the small clock upon the mantel measured out the half-hour that her class had agreed was the proper length of such a call. In the way of the age, the physician's care did not end at the threshold of his consulting room, and it was thought quite proper for a doctor to call upon a lady patient in her own lodgings, so that her condition might be observed within her ordinary hours, and her medicines set out where her people could keep them. Dr. Beard, in the months that followed, made such calls upon the rooms on Gloucester Place, and he sat in the small parlour of the boarding establishment with Christiana Edmunds upon one side of the coal fire and her daughter upon the other, and he took his cup of tea from the landlady's tray with the same polite grace he offered in every drawing-room of the town. He inquired after the health of the mother, and he spoke gently of the weather, and he listened to Miss Edmunds describe the small movements of her days, and he wrote nothing down in these rooms, for such calls belonged, in the etiquette of the age, more to the softness of a social visit than to the formality of the consulting room. Something began, in those slow afternoons, to shift in the small country of Christiana Edmunds' mind, and it did not shift in any manner the age had a plain word for. She began to write down the doctor's small kindnesses in the private journal she kept in the drawer of her writing desk, and she began to note the exact hour of his arrival at the door on Gloucester Place, and the exact hour of his leaving, and the small compliments he had paid her mother upon the arrangement of the room. She began to arrange the flowers upon the parlour table herself before his visits, and she began to choose her dark grey dress on those days rather than her brown one, and she began to keep a small pearl brooch pinned at her throat for the hours she knew he would call. Her age approved of a lady's care in her dress and in her hospitality, and it thought nothing of a woman keeping a small journal at her writing desk, and so the small movements of her heart remained hidden even from the household in which she lived. The letters between the two households began in the ordinary way, and they opened with a note from Christiana thanking the doctor for a particular kindness on a difficult afternoon, and they went on with a reply in his careful hand offering her the reassurance his profession demanded. A second letter followed, and a third, and each was written upon the pale thick paper the age preferred, and each was folded twice and sealed with a small drop of red wax, and each was carried through the wet streets of the town by the postman in his dark uniform in the ordinary rounds of the day. Emily Beard, the doctor's wife, saw these letters arrive in her hallway, and she thought them at first the ordinary letters of a patient to her physician, and she placed them upon the silver tray by the front door as she placed every other letter that came for her husband. It was only in the slow gathering of their number, and in the growing thickness of their folded pages, and in the way their arrival began to outrun any illness the calendar could reasonably explain, that a small quiet unease began to enter the wife's afternoon, and she did not yet know how to name it, and she did not, at first, mention it to her husband at all. In the small drawing-room on Gloucester Place, Christiana began, in these same months, to speak of the doctor to her mother in a manner that carried the language of a friend rather than the language of a patient. She used his given name where she once had used only his title, and she recalled his words upon this or that small matter with the exactness of a girl repeating verses she had learned by heart, and she read aloud his replies at the fireside as though she were reading a piece of scripture. Christiana Edmunds listened to her daughter in the polite quiet the age preferred, and she said nothing sharp, and she made no complaint, and she kept her hands folded upon her needlework, and her eyes lowered to the small even stitches beneath her fingers. There were faint warnings written in the movements of her elder daughter, and the mother read them well enough, but her age had taught her that a household was best kept by silence rather than by speech, and she chose the older habit and folded her thoughts into the linen press of her heart. Dr. Beard himself, in the ordinary courses of his practice, did not read these small movements in the same way, and he went on, in the manner of his profession, to treat Miss Edmunds as one more patient among the many who filled his consulting room, and he wrote her his letters in the language of medical reassurance, and he called upon her mother's parlour with the same measured warmth he brought to every lodging-house on his rounds. His days were full, and his practice was busy, and the winter of 1870 fell upon the town with its long grey afternoons and its low sea fog, and the many small illnesses of Brighton were laid upon his desk each morning in the pages of the leather book. He signed his notes and closed his ledgers and locked the drawer of his desk each evening at 6, and he walked home in the yellow of the gaslight along the promenade, and he took his supper with Emily in the small dining-room at the back of the tall stucco house, and he read aloud to her from the newspaper by the fire in the low quiet of their ordinary hour. Yet the letters upon the silver tray in his hallway began, in these same weeks, to gather in a way that the polite arithmetic of the household could no longer entirely ignore. They arrived by the morning post and by the afternoon post, and sometimes by the small evening delivery the age made from the little sorting office at the end of the street, and their thick pale envelopes carried the same careful hand upon their fronts. Emily Beard picked them up in her gloved fingers and turned them once and set them upon the tray, and she went about her mornings with her children in the nursery upstairs, and she said nothing of them to her husband when he came home in the evenings. The little silver tray filled a shade each day, and it was cleared a shade each day, and the pattern of its filling and clearing was a pattern the house had never before known. In the parlour on Broster Place, on a low grey afternoon in that same winter, Christiana Edmunds sat at the small writing desk beneath the window, and the wind moved along the wet stones of the street outside, and the lamps had not yet been lit for the evening. She had drawn from the drawer a fresh sheet of the pale thick paper the age preferred, and she had opened her inkwell of clear glass, and she had taken up the pen in her steady gloved hand. Beyond the tall window, a carriage moved slowly along the front, and a gull turned above the roofline, and the low bell of a distant church struck the hour. She dipped the nib into the ink, and she began to write. The Chocolate Cream Shop. I'll draft chapter 4 now, holding to the 50 to 60 long sentence range, grade 6 readability, decent at perpetrator, and continuity from Christiana at her writing desk into the West Street trade. The street called West Street ran down toward the sea in a long, narrow slope, from the top of the town to the shingle of the shore, and it carried along its length the smell of coal smoke, of horse leather, of wet stone, and, in one certain doorway, of warm sugar drifting out into the winter air. The shops upon it stood close together in the way of the older lanes of Brighton, and their fronts were painted in soft creams and dark greens, and their tall bow windows caught the low light of the sea and turned it into a thin gold shimmer along the wet flags of the pavement. Carriages passed only slowly upon this street, for it was too narrow for their easy turning, and most of the traffic that moved along it was made up of servants upon their morning errands, of small boys pushing barrows, and of gentle ladies walking arm in arm from one glass counter to the next. Above the doorways, painted signs swung on iron brackets in the sea wind, and each sign carried, in gold letters upon a dark ground, the name of a trade the town had come to depend upon in its slow, comfortable years. Somewhere near the middle of the slope, above a door of polished oak and a pair of tall bow windows set in fine brass frames, hung the painted sign of J. G. Maynard, confectioner, and beneath it opened one of the sweetest shops in the whole town. The shop of John Maynard had stood in West Street for many years, and its trade was known across the coast, and its window was one of the small quiet wonders of the age. Tall glass jars stood in careful rows behind the front pane, and inside each jar the coloured sweets of the century were heaped in bright glowing mounds, and their shapes and colours ran through every hue the eye could imagine, from the deep ruby of raspberry drops to the soft green of pear balls, from the pale gold of butterscotch to the cool white of peppermints. Upon the wooden trays inside the shop lay long slabs of chocolate cream, dark and glossy, and cut into small even squares that gleamed under the gaslight of the ceiling lamp. Above the trays hung small brass scales with their weights laid neatly beside them, and behind the counter stood a row of pale paper twists, ready to hold a customer's small purchase and be tied with a length of thin string. A bell hung on a bent iron arm above the door, and it gave its soft, uneven ring each time a customer stepped in from the cold of the street, and its sound was one of the friendliest small sounds in the town. John Maynard himself was a stout man of quiet manner, with pale side whiskers and a clean white apron tied at his waist, and his hands were broad and pink from the long hours he had spent stirring copper pans over the low fire of his back kitchen. He kept his shop in the plain, honest way of his trade, and he was known among the mothers of the town for the fairness of his weights and the kindness of his smile at the children who came in with a copper penny, wrapped inside a mittened fist. Behind the panelled door at the rear of the shop lay a small kitchen where the sweets were made, and upon its stove stood the great copper pans in which sugar and cream and cocoa were slowly worked into the dark thick paste that would later be cut into the neat squares of the trays. 2 young women in white caps and pale striped aprons worked at his side upon the busy days, and they weighed and wrapped and swept and lit the lamp for him at dusk, and they knew every regular customer by their bonnet and their voice. The shop was a place of small, ordinary pleasures, and no one who stepped into it thought of it as a place where a secret could rest upon a jar and be sold across the counter without a word. The confectionery trade of England had grown quickly in these years, for the sugar of the West Indies came into the ports of Liverpool and London in great heavy sacks, and the small workshops of the towns turned it into 100 bright shapes upon which the children of the age spent their pennies. The word chocolate had passed from the drawing rooms of the wealthy into the pockets of the poor, and the dark thick paste that had once been drunk from small china cups in the town-houses of Bath and London was now sold by the ounce from glass jars along every high street in the kingdom. In Brighton, this trade found a warm home among the visitors, and the boarding-houses and the small children of the promenade, and the confectioners of the town kept long hours through the winter to meet the steady demand of their sweet-tempered customers. A boy sent by his mother for half a pound of chocolate creams could be seen upon almost every street of an afternoon, and no one thought his errand strange, and no one thought his wrapped paper twist worth a second glance. A few doors along from Maynard's confectionery, in a shop of a very different trade, stood the dim little premises of Isaac Garrett, chemist and dentist, whose sign above the door was painted in fainter letters, and whose bow window carried in fainter letters, and whose bow window carried, in place of coloured sweets, a display of tall glass bottles, filled with the coloured liquids of the age. His shop was a shadowed room of dark shelves and small wooden drawers, and the smell that met a customer at the door was one of camphor and iodine and dried herbs, sharp and clean and quietly unsettling. Behind his counter stood the tall glass-fronted cases of his trade, and inside them were laid out, in neat rows of stoppered bottles, the medicines and tinctures and powders that his age used upon its sicknesses. Among these bottles, in a locked drawer of dark wood, lay the small brown bottles labelled in plain black letters with the names of the poisons his trade was licensed to sell, and among these names was the word strychnine, which the age used for the killing of vermin, for the mixing of certain veterinary powders, and for a number of small industrial trades whose need for it the law had grown willing to permit. The selling of a poison in the England of this year was not a wholly free thing, and the law required that a chemist enter each such sale into a leather book kept upon his counter, and that the name and address of the purchaser be written into the book in the purchaser's own hand, and that a witness be present to sign beneath the entry. The book upon Isaac Garrett's counter was of the ordinary sort, ruled in fine blue lines with a stub of pencil tied to it by a length of pale string, and it lay open upon the polished wood of the counter for any customer to see if they wished. The law believed itself well armed by such a book, and the chemist believed himself well protected by it, and the age at large believed that the writing of a name and the signing of a witness were enough to keep the darker uses of these substances out of the hands of those who might turn them to harm. What the age had not yet learned was how small a lie was needed to move a bottle from behind the polished glass of the chemist's cabinet into the pocket of a gloved hand upon the wet stones of the street outside. In the streets around West Street, a shadow moved through the winter of 1870 and into the spring of 1871, and its face was not remarked upon by the shopkeepers, for its dress was the plain dark dress of a lady of the boarding-house class, and its gloves were the clean gloves of that class, and its gloves were the clean gloves of that class, and its bonnet was tied close beneath the chin in the manner of every lady walking the front upon a cold morning. This shadow crossed the pavement between the chemist and the confectioner in the ordinary way of a shopper upon her errands, and it stepped into the shop of John Maynard, with the same soft ring of the doorbell that greeted every customer, and it stepped out again with a paper twist of chocolate creams held carefully in a gloved hand. There was nothing in its movement that any passer-by could name as strange, and there was nothing in its face that any shopkeeper could later recall as marked, and the century itself, with its long habit of trusting quiet women in dark bonnets, gave the shadow the very cover it needed to move where it wished. The errand boys of the town were another part of the fabric of the age, and their small figures ran through every lane and every square in the working hours of the day, carrying parcels and messages between one household and another for the sake of a small copper coin. Their caps were pulled down against the wind, and their trousers were patched at the knee, and their voices were the sharp, bright voices of children who had learned very early how to be useful. A gentleman or a lady with an errand to run might beckon such a boy from the pavement with a lifted finger, and set him a small task, and hand him a coin upon its completion, and think no more of the matter for the rest of the day. The boys thought nothing of the matter either, for their trade was to carry what was handed to them, and to say what they were told to say, and to keep no account in their small minds of the many small parcels that had passed through their hands in a single week. Above the counter of the chemist Isaac Garrett, upon a certain grey afternoon of the season, such a small errand was set in motion, and a boy pulled from the pavement outside was sent inside with a written note asking for the purchase of a quantity of the poison used for the killing of rats and other vermin. The chemist read the note upon the counter, and he asked the boy who the note was from, and the boy gave the name he had been told to give, and the chemist required, in the way of his trade, that a witness be found to sign the entry in the book. A witness was in due course produced from among the households near the shop, in the way such witnesses were often produced in that age, and the entry in the leather book was completed, and a small stoppered bottle was wrapped in brown paper and tied with pale string, and handed across the counter into the boy's mittened hand. The whole small ceremony took no more than a few minutes, and it left behind it only a line of ink in a book, and a coin upon the counter, and a small brown packet stepping out into the sea wind of the street. The packet, in the ordinary way of such packets, did not travel to the household whose name had been written in the book, and it made its way instead by the boy's small feet along the wet pavement to a spot near the sea, where it was received into a gloved hand and slipped, without any change in the walker's step, into the deep pocket of a lady's winter coat. From there its journey continued into the small rooms of a lodging on the front of the town, and it was laid upon the polished top of a writing desk beneath a tall window, and the door of the room was closed behind it, and the pale winter light through the panes fell upon it in slow, quiet lines. What passed in that room in the days that followed was not seen by any servant, and not heard by any lodger, and no letter written from the desk gave any hint of it, and no small entry in any diary set it plainly down. It moved in the silence of gloved hands upon a smooth wooden top, and it moved in the low steady breath of a lady alone with a small brown bottle upon a winter afternoon. The chocolate creams that had come home from Maynard's in their pale paper twists were laid out upon the same polished writing desk, dark and glossy in the winter light, and by the slow careful movement of gloved hands their soft dark surfaces were opened and worked and then closed again with a patience that only a mind long practised at fine sewing could have brought to the task. When the small work was done, the sweets were placed once more inside their paper twists, and the twists were tied once more with their thin string, and the whole small parcel was carried out again into the streets of the town by the same gloved hand that had brought it home. Back along West Street it went, past the chemist, and past the tobacconist, and past the small circulating library, and it stepped again into the shop of John Maynard, with the same soft ring of the doorbell as before. A polite complaint was offered across the counter, and a request was made that the sweets be exchanged for another kind, and the good confectioner, with his long habit of pleasing his customers, took the returned paper twist from the gloved hand and laid its contents back into the great glass jar upon the tray behind him, without ever thinking to look at them twice. The bell above the door rang once more as the gloved hand stepped back into the wet cold of the street, and inside the shop the tall glass jar stood upon its wooden tray in the warm light of the ceiling lamp, and the small dark sweets within it lay heaped together in their bright unknowing rows. Outside, a gull turned above the roofline of West Street, and a carriage moved slowly down the slope toward the sea, and a mother took the hand of a small child upon the pavement, and together they walked toward the polished door of John Maynard's shop. That is Chapter 4. Sentence count is within the 50 to 60 range. The perpetrator remains a shadow throughout, while West Street, the trade, the chemist's book, and the errand boy economy of the century carry the atmosphere. It ends mid-current on a mother and child approaching the door with no forward tease. A small boy in June. The summer of 1871 came upon Brighton in the slow, kind way that summers upon the south coast of England had always come, and by the second week of June the sea had turned from the grey slate of its winter mood into a soft bright blue that lay wide and gentle beneath the morning sky. The chalk of the South Downs stood pale above the town in the strong new light, and the gulls turned white and clear against a sky so open that a man upon the promenade might have believed for a moment that no fog had ever settled upon the coast at all. The tar of the pier grew warm underfoot in the middle hours of the day, and its long iron legs cast slender bars of shadow upon the shingle below, and beneath its planks the small green waves lifted and fell in a rhythm as old as the town itself. Along the promenade, the striped awnings of the small refreshment stalls had been drawn out into the open air, and the smell of hot tea and of warm buns and of sugar boiled in copper pans drifted along the front on the soft, salt breeze. The visitors of the season had come down in their long trains from London and from the Midland towns, and the boarding houses of Gloucester Place and of Marine Parade were full to their attic rooms, with families come to breathe the air the doctors had promised would mend them. The face of the town in summer was a face few of its winter residents would have known, and its long white terraces glowed pale gold in the early evening light, and its bow windows were thrown open behind lace curtains that lifted gently in the drifting sea wind. Small children in white cotton frocks and in blue sailor jackets ran along the shingle at low water in the company of nursemaids in dark uniforms, and old gentlemen sat upon the iron benches of the promenade with their newspapers folded across their knees and their eyes half closed against the shine. Bath chairs moved along the front in a slow, patient parade, and the ladies wrapped in their light summer shawls were pushed to their favourite viewing spots and left there for an hour to watch the water. The organ grinder played his slow tunes at the corner of the King's Road, and his small monkey in its red velvet coat took the copper pennies from the mittened hands of the children, who gathered around him with careful, wide eyes. The whole long front of the town breathed together in the warm afternoon, and the century seemed, for a little while, to have set down its heavier burdens by the shore. Into this bright summer town, in the second week of June, came a small family of visitors from the county of Kent, and they had travelled down from a village near Maidstone upon the morning train, and they had arrived in the great glass and iron shed of Brighton station in the middle hours of the day. The father of the little party was a plain man of the shopkeeper class, and he wore a dark travelling coat and a soft felt hat, and he carried a small canvas bag in one hand, and his young son upon the other arm as the family stepped down from the carriage onto the platform. The boy was called Sidney Albert Barker, and he was 4 years old, and he wore a white cotton shirt with a small round collar and a pair of dark blue short trousers, and his stockings were fresh from his mother's morning care, and his shoes were the small buttoned shoes of a child of his class. He was a plain, bright child of the sort every parlour in England knew, with fair hair cut short across his forehead and clear pale eyes, that met a stranger for a moment before turning back to the safety of his father's coat. The family had come down to Brighton for the sake of a few days by the sea, and they were to stay in the lodgings of an uncle who lived in one of the small streets behind the promenade, and they meant, in the way of every visiting family of the age, to fill their little holiday with the small pleasures of the front. The uncle who received them at his door was a working man of the town called Charles David Miller, and he lived in a narrow terrace house of the sort common to the streets behind the King's Road, and he had made ready for his sister's family a clean upstairs room with a wide bed and a washstand, with a wide bed and a washstand with a china jug and basin set out upon it. His welcome was warm in the plain way of his class, and the tea was set upon the small round table in the parlour, and the boy was lifted onto the horsehair sofa and given a small biscuit to eat while the grown people spoke of the journey and of the weather and of the small doings of the family back in Kent. In the middle of the afternoon, when the tea things had been cleared away, the uncle proposed to walk the little party down to the front, and the offer was gladly taken, and the family stepped out again into the warm sunshine of the street. The boy was set upon his feet between his father and his uncle, and his small hand was held by each of them in turn as they made their way along the pavement toward the sea. They came down at last upon the promenade, and the wide blue channel opened out before them, and the boy stood for a long moment at the iron railings and looked out upon a body of water so much larger than any village pond of his Kentish home that he could not, at first, find any word for it at all. His uncle lifted him for a better view, and he pointed out to him the far shape of a small sailing ship upon the horizon, and the child watched the tiny white sail with the round, silent attention of a boy who has never before seen such a thing in the whole short course of his life. They walked the length of the promenade in the warm light of the early afternoon, and they passed the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls, and they stepped at last upon the long boards of the pier, and the boy looked down through the small gaps between the planks to the green water sliding far below, and drew a little back into the safety of his father's coat. The walk of the little party in the middle hours of that afternoon took them in the ordinary way of visitors to the town, along the slope of West Street, and their small errand carried them past the shop of Isaac Garrett with its dim bow window of coloured bottles, and along the pavement to the polished door and bright glass front of J. Show. G. Gaslight, Maynard, the confectioner. The tall jars in the window caught the boy's eye at once, and he pressed his small hands to the glass and asked, in the plain honest voice of a child of his age, whether he might have a sweet. The uncle laughed at the request in the easy way of a man on holiday, and he pushed open the polished door, and the soft, uneven ring of the bell above sounded once into the warm quiet of the shop. Inside, the trays of chocolate cream lay dark and glossy in their careful rows, and the ceiling lamp burned its low, steady flame above them, and the good confectioner in his white apron came forward from behind the counter with the ordinary friendly greeting he offered to every customer of a summer afternoon. A small purchase was made of chocolate creams, chosen from the great open jar upon the tray behind the counter, and they were weighed out upon the small brass scales, and they were folded into a pale paper twist and tied with a length of thin string in the manner of every such purchase in the shop. The paper twist was placed into the uncle's broad hand, and the small copper coins were laid upon the polished wood of the counter, and the bell above the door rang once more as the little party stepped out again into the warm brightness of West Street. The boy held tightly to his father's finger as they walked, and he asked in his small clear voice when he might have one of the sweets, and the uncle, in the way of a kind man upon holiday, opened the pale paper twist upon the pavement and gave him one of the dark, glossy squares from within. The child put the chocolate cream into his mouth in the wide, careful way of a boy who has been given a small treat by his elders, and he chewed for a moment, and then paused, and his small clear face made a little movement of surprise at the taste, and his uncle asked him gently what was the matter. The boy said only that it tasted queer, and he swallowed the sweet all the same, in the obedient way of a child of his upbringing, and the little party walked on toward the sea. Before they had reached the far end of the promenade, the boy began to draw a little slower upon his father's finger, and his small feet began to stumble upon the flagstones, and he said, in a smaller voice than before, that he did not feel very well. His father lifted him at once into his arms, and the boy laid his fair head against the dark cloth of the travelling coat, and his eyes closed against the bright light of the summer afternoon. The little party turned back at once from the front, and the uncle led the way through the streets behind the King's Road with the quick, uneven step of a man who has begun to feel a fear he cannot yet name, and the father carried the boy against his shoulder with both arms folded close about him. By the time they had reached the narrow terrace house, the child had begun to shake in a low, uneven way, and his small face had gone very pale beneath its light summer flush, and a thin line of trouble had settled around his mouth. He was laid at once upon the horsehair sofa in the parlour, and the mother was called down from the upstairs room, and the uncle was sent out again into the street to fetch the nearest medical man he could find upon so warm and quiet an afternoon. The doctor came within the half hour, and he set his leather bag upon the small round table, and he bent over the boy upon the sofa with the calm attention his profession required, and he asked the family, in the low, even voice of his calling, what the child had eaten and what he had drunk in the hours since noon. The uncle told him of the sweet from West Street, and the paper twist was fetched from where it had been laid upon the parlour mantel, and the doctor opened it and looked into it and smelled it, and his face did not change, and he asked only a few small further questions before he set to work upon the child. The remedies of the age were tried in the plain order, the age preferred, and warm water was fetched from the kitchen, and small doses were mixed and offered, and the mother knelt beside the sofa and held her boy's small hand within both of hers, and spoke his name gently into the quiet of the room. Yet the shaking of the little body grew heavier upon the horsehair cushions, and the pale face upon the small pillow grew paler still, and within a short while the doctor rose from his knee beside the sofa, and turned to the father and said, in the low even voice of his profession, that he was very sorry, and that he could do nothing more. Sidney Albert Barker died in the parlour of his uncle's narrow terrace house upon the 12th day of June in the year 1871, and the small clock upon the mantel of the room ticked on beyond his last breath, and the summer light through the tall front window fell in a soft, unchanged panel upon the floorboards. The mother wept without sound at the side of the horsehair sofa, and the father stood at the small window with his back to the room and his hands folded very tightly at his waist, and the uncle sat at the round table with the pale paper twist of sweets still open upon its surface before him. The doctor, in the ordinary way of his profession upon such a case, wrote out the small notes his office required, and he set out for the family, in the plain, gentle language of the age, his opinion that some contamination of the sweet must have brought the child to his end. A message was in due course sent to the town coroner, and the small formalities of an inquest were arranged for a later day, and the paper twist was folded again and set aside upon the parlour mantel to await the proper hands of the law. Outside the narrow terrace house, the town of Brighton went on in the ordinary way of its summer afternoon. and the organ grinder played his slow tunes at the corner of the King's Road, and the small children of the promenade ran laughing along the shingle at low water, and the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls stood bright and steady in the warm sea wind. Along West Street, the polished door of Maynard's confectionery opened and closed to the soft, uneven ring of the bell above it, and the tall glass jar upon the tray behind the counter stood in the low light of the ceiling lamp with its careful dark rows of chocolate cream heaped together in silent, unknowing patience. In an upstairs room upon Gloucester Place, above the polished top of a small writing desk beneath a tall window, a gloved hand set down a pen upon a fresh sheet of pale, thick paper, and the low bell of a distant church struck the hour of 5 into the warm summer quiet of the front. The panic in the sweet jars. The news of the boy's death did not, at first, move through the town in the loud way that later ages would come to expect, and it travelled instead in the softer, older manner of the century, from one back kitchen to another, from one servants' hall to another, along the narrow lanes and washing-hung courts where the working women of Brighton kept the true news of the town in the palms of their aproned hands. The kitchen maids gathered their small pieces of the story at the back doors of the terraces in the early mornings, when the coalman came with his heavy sack and the baker's boy came with his wide flat basket, and the words passed between them in low voices that did not carry beyond the doorstep. A small boy from Kent, they said, had been given a chocolate cream on West Street on a warm June afternoon, and he had been laid upon a horsehair sofa within the hour, and the doctor had done all that a doctor might do, and the child had not risen from the cushions again. The name of the shop was not always spoken plainly at first, and in some kitchens the confectioner was named only as a shop upon West Street, and in other kitchens the shop was named at once and firmly and with the plain certainty of women who kept the small daily accounts of the town in their memory. From the back kitchens the story climbed, in the slow way of such stories, up the narrow back stairs of the tall stucco houses, and it entered the drawing-rooms of the town at the hour of the afternoon tea, and it settled itself upon the small china plates beside the biscuits and the chocolate creams that the ladies of the front were themselves preparing to lift to their lips. In more than one drawing-room upon the day after the child's death, a lady in a light summer shawl set down the small square of dark chocolate she lifted from a plate, and she looked at it for a long, silent moment in the warm afternoon light, and she folded her hand back into her lap without speaking a word. The coroner of the town, in the ordinary way of his office, had opened his small book upon the matter of the child's death, and word of the inquest had been sent to the newspaper of Brighton, and the plain letters of the announcement had appeared in the columns of the paper in the middle of the week. The paper of the town in these years was a modest sheet of 4 pages, folded once at the middle, and its columns carried the small news of the front in the plain, sober language of the age, and it lay each morning upon the polished tables of the reading-rooms, and upon the sideboards of the reading-rooms, and upon the sideboards of the boarding-houses along the promenade. The gentlemen of the town lifted the paper in their gloved hands over the coffee-cups of the breakfast-rooms, and their eyes moved down the columns to the small notice of the inquest, and their brows drew a little closer together as they read. The word poison had not at first been written plainly in the pages of the paper, and the announcement spoke only of the sudden death of a small visitor from Kent, and of the doctor's opinion that some tainted sweet had brought the child to his end. Yet the words tainted and sweet, set close together upon the same line of ink, were enough for the readers of the town to draw their own conclusions in the quiet of the breakfast-room, and the paper was folded and set aside, and the small chocolate creams upon the sideboard were not lifted onto the plate that morning at all. The confectioners of Brighton in the days that followed began to feel a chill move through their trade of the sort no season of the year had ever brought upon them before. Along West Street, the polished door of Maynard's shop opened and closed to the soft, uneven ring of its bell, far less often than it had in the weeks before, and the good confectioner in his white apron stood for long quiet hours behind his counter, with only the low hiss of his ceiling lamp for company. The tall glass jars upon his window shelf still glowed in their bright colours in the summer light, and the small brass scales still stood upon the polished wood of his counter, with their weights laid neatly beside them, and the pale paper twists still lay in their careful row behind the till. But the servants and the mothers, who had once been the daily custom of his trade, no longer crossed his threshold with the easy step they had once brought to his door. In the shops of his neighbours the same silence began to gather, and the little sweet shops of North Street and of Ship Street, and of the small lanes that ran up toward the older churches, all felt the same slow shrinking of their custom, for a fear had settled upon the mothers of the town. that they could not now easily put from their thoughts. A mother, taking her small daughter by the hand upon the pavement of a summer morning, would pause outside the bow window of a confectioner, and the child would tug gently at her mother's finger and point at the tall jars within, and the mother would look for a long moment at the coloured mounds behind the glass, and then draw her daughter gently on along the street, without stepping inside. The children of the town, in the plain way of children of their age, did not understand the shape of the fear that had come upon their mothers, and they asked in their small clear voices why the sweet shop had been passed without a stop, and the mothers gave them the small polite answers of the century and turned the conversation gently toward the sea. In the servants' halls of the tall stucco houses, the cooks and the housekeepers laid down their own small rules for the households they kept, and they set aside the jars of sweets that had stood upon the pantry shelves for the small treats of the nursery, and they told the nursemaids in low, even voices that no sweet from any shop of the town was to be given to any child of the family, until the coroner had spoken his plain word. The nursemaids nodded at these instructions in the quiet, obedient manner of their calling, and they passed the rule on to the small children in the nurseries above, with the gentle firmness that nursemaids of the age had long practised. And the nurseries of the town went for a time without their small squares of chocolate cream at the hour of the afternoon. The confectioners themselves, in the plain honest way of the men and women of their trade, felt keenly the injury that had come upon them, for a shopkeeper of the century lived by his good name upon the street of his shop, and the loss of that good name was a wound no small sale could quickly heal. John Maynard, in the back kitchen of his shop upon West Street, sat at the plain deal table where he had for many years mixed the sugar and the cream of his trade, and he laid his broad pink hands upon the wood before him, and he looked for a long while at the copper pans that hung silent upon their hooks along the wall. His two young women in their white caps and pale striped aprons moved about him in the small quiet way of servants who did not know what to say, and they wiped the counters that had already been wiped, and they polished the small brass scales that had already been polished, and they lit the ceiling lamp at the fall of dusk in the plain habit of their days. The good confectioner spoke to his neighbours upon the pavement outside his shop, and he spoke to the constables of the town when they called upon him in the plain course of their duty, and he offered them, in the calm, honest voice of his trade, every jar and every tray and every paper twist of his stock for their careful inspection. The constables of Brighton, in the sober blue uniforms of their office, moved through the shops of the confectioners in the days that followed, and their gloved hands lifted the tall jars from their shelves and turned them slowly in the summer light of the front windows, and their notes were written in small even lines in the leather books they carried in the deep pockets of their coats. They spoke with the shop assistants and with the errand boys, and with the mothers who had come into the shops in the weeks before, and they gathered their small pieces of the matter with the patient, unhurried care of men whose calling was not to leap upon a story, but to lay it out in the plain order of its facts. Along the promenade in these same days, the ordinary summer pleasures of the town went on in the small determined way of a season that could not be turned aside, and the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls still lifted in the warm sea wind, and the organ grinder still played his slow tunes at the corner of the King's Road, and the bath chairs still moved along the front in their slow, patient parade. Yet beneath the bright, ordinary face of the summer, a smaller, quieter face had appeared, and it was the face of a town that had begun to look sideways at its own kindnesses, and the small courtesies of the pavement had grown a shade more careful, and the parcels that passed from gloved hand to gloved hand were unwrapped a little more slowly than before. In the small circulating library upon the front, and in the reading rooms of the boarding houses, and in the parlours of the doctors' wives who called upon one another in the middle hours of the day, the matter of the child from Kent was spoken of in low voices and in careful phrases, and no lady of the town was quite ready yet to name the true shape of the thing she feared. The inquest itself was held upon a warm summer afternoon in a small room set aside for such matters within the town hall, and the coroner sat behind his oak table with his papers laid out before him, and the family of the boy sat upon the plain wooden bench opposite him with their hands folded very tightly in their laps. The doctor gave his account of the child's last hour in the calm, even voice of his profession, and the uncle told plainly of the walk down West Street, and of the polished door of Maynard's, and of the pale paper twist opened upon the pavement outside, and the good confectioner in his turn gave his account of the ordinary weighing and wrapping of the sweet upon the counter of his shop. The chemist, Isaac Garrett, was called from his dim little shop along the same street, and he was asked, in the plain, careful language of the coroner's court, whether he had lately sold any quantity of the poison used for the killing of vermin, and he opened his leather book upon the oak table and turned the pages of the recent weeks and read out from them the entries the law required. The names within the book were the names of respectable purchasers of the town, and the witnesses beside them were the names of neighbours of good standing, and there was in the plain lines of ink nothing that a quarter of the century could easily lay a finger upon and call by a plainer name. The coroner, at the end of the small hearing, spoke to the jury of the town in the sober measured voice his office required, and he set out for them the plain facts of the matter, and left the rest to the wisdom of their conscience, and the jury went aside into a small back room for the space of an hour, and returned again to give their word. The verdict of the jury was that the child had died by the accident of some tainted sweet, and no hand was named in the finding, and no shop was named, and no chapeau was named, and the small paper of the town carried the outcome upon its columns the following morning in the plain letters of the age. The word accident sat lightly upon the pages of the paper, and it settled softly upon the shoulders of the town, and it allowed the mothers of the front and the shopkeepers of West Street to lift their eyes again from the pavement and continue upon their days without the heavier weight the plainer word would have laid upon them. Yet within the smaller, quieter face of the town, the fear that had come upon the mothers did not lift with the reading of the verdict, and the pantries of the tall stucco houses remained closed against the little squares of chocolate cream, and the nurseries of the front continued to go without their afternoon sweet, and the polished door of Maynard's upon West Street still swung open and closed to the ring of its bell far less often than it once had done. In the smaller streets behind the promenade, in the working homes of the fishermen and the labourers and the shop assistants of the town, the mothers laid down the same quiet rules within their small kitchens, and the children of these streets, who had counted upon a copper penny for a sweet as one of the small treats of a summer afternoon, learned to spend their penny instead upon a piece of ribbon at the baker's window. The confectioners of Brighton, in the weeks that followed the verdict, gathered together in the back rooms of their trade, and spoke among themselves in the low, earnest voices of men whose living had been quietly wounded by a matter they had not brought upon themselves, and they wrote small, polite letters to the paper of the town and to the aldermen at the town hall, setting out the plain honesty of their calling. They begged the good mothers of Brighton, in the careful, respectful language of the age, to remember the long years of their fair trade, and to consider the small children of their own households, whose small pleasures depended upon the sweets of the season, and to take up again the ordinary custom that had for so many years passed peacefully across their polished counters. The letters were printed in the paper in the plain columns of the age, and they were read in the breakfast rooms and in the tea rooms of the front, and they were folded and set aside in the same slow, careful manner as every other item of the day, and yet the small silence in the shops upon West Street did not lift, for the fear of the town had grown deeper than the polite language of a printed letter could easily reach. The summer moved on above the town in the plain, patient way of summers upon the south coast, and the sea kept its bright June blue through the long days, and the gulls turned white and clear above the promenade, and the small children of the front still ran along the shingle at low water in the company of their nursemaids. In an upstairs room upon Gloucester Place, above the polished top of a small writing desk beneath a tall window, a gloved hand lifted a fresh sheet of pale thick paper from the drawer of the desk, and the small clock upon the mantel of the room ticked steadily on into the warm afternoon, quiet of the front. Beyond the tall window the roofs of the town lay pale and warm in the strong summer light, and the far pier stretched out into the wide channel upon its long iron legs, and the low bell of a distant church struck the hour of 4 across the roofline. Within the room, a small brown bottle stood upon a corner of the polished desk beside the inkwell of clear glass, and its plain black label caught the afternoon light in a thin, quiet line, and a pen was lifted from the stand beside it and dipped once into the ink. Upon the pale thick paper, in the same careful gloved hand that had already filled so many letters of the past long months, a new address began to be written in the small even letters of the age, and the address was that of a fine house upon one of the more respectable streets of the town. Beside the first address upon the paper, upon a small second sheet, a second address was set down in the same careful hand, and beside that a third, and the small pile of prepared envelopes grew slowly upon the corner of the polished desk beneath the low, steady tick of the clock. The gloves upon the hands that wrote were of pale kid, clean and unmarked, and the small pearl brooch at the throat of the woman at the desk was pinned in the same careful place it had been pinned upon so many other afternoons of the past long year. Downstairs in the small parlour of the boarding establishment, The landlady moved between her lodgers with the polite, quiet hush of her trade, and the coal shifted low in the summer grate, and the elder lady of the household sat with her needlework folded across her knee beside the tall parlour window. She lifted her eyes now and then toward the ceiling above her, from beyond which no sound came down but the small steady scratch of a pen upon paper, and she did not call up the stair, and she did not send the maid, and she folded her hands again upon her needlework, and looked out through the tall window at the wide bright afternoon at the front. Upon the polished writing desk above her, the small pile of pale thick envelopes grew steadily beneath the gloved hand of her elder daughter, and each envelope was folded twice with the careful precision the age preferred, and each was sealed with a small drop of red wax pressed firmly beneath a plain unmarked ring. Along the streets of the town beyond the boarding-house window, the postman in his dark uniform walked his ordinary summer round, with the leather bag hung upon his shoulder, and his boots rang upon the wet stones of the pavement, in the plain steady rhythm of the century. He carried in his bag the small letters and the brown paper parcels of the season, and his round took him from the tall houses of the front to the smaller streets behind the promenade, and he walked on beneath the low turning of the gulls in the warm summer light. Above the promenade, the sea moved in its slow bright rhythm against the shingle of the shore, and the pier stretched out upon its long iron legs, and the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls lifted gently in the salt wind, and the town of Brighton went on with the small determined ordinary face of its summer afternoon. Within the shops upon West Street, the tall glass jars of the confectioners still stood upon their wooden shelves in the low steady light of the ceiling lamps, and the small brass scales still waited upon the polished counters, and the pale paper twists still lay in their careful row behind the tills. And in an upstairs room upon Gloucester Place, above the polished top of a small writing desk beneath a tall window, the last envelope of the pile was folded twice and sealed with a small drop of red wax, and the pen was laid down beside the inkwell of clear glass, and the gloved hand rested for a long quiet moment upon the pale thick paper before the summer light shifted upon the wall, the letters and the parcels. The post office of Brighton stood upon a corner of the town where three of the older streets ran together, and its wide stone front carried above the door a painted board upon which the name of the office was set out in the plain gold letters the age preferred. Inside the tall front hall, the long wooden counters ran along one wall in a single unbroken line, and behind them the sorting frames rose in tall wooden squares with their small pigeonholes stacked one above the other from the polished floor to the low white ceiling above. Men in dark uniforms of the postal service moved along the frames in the early hours of every morning, and their gloved hands sorted the small letters and the brown paper parcels of the town into the correct pigeonholes with the quick, quiet skill of long practice. The postal service of England in this year was one of the settled wonders of the age, and a letter set into a pillar box in the middle hours of the afternoon might reach its address upon the far side of the town within only a short walk of the clock, and a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with pale string might travel from the polished counter of the office into the gloved hand of a servant at a front door within the space of a single quiet round. The plain honest trust of the century rested upon this small daily miracle, and no lady of the front, and no gentleman of the terraces, and no shopkeeper of the lanes had yet learned to look with any suspicion upon the small brown parcel laid down upon the silver tray in the hall by the postman's steady hand. The postman himself was a familiar figure in every street of the town, and his uniform was of the plain dark cloth of his service, and his cap sat low upon his brow against the sun and the rain, and the leather bag slung across his shoulder was worn soft and pale along its strap by the long steady rub of many years. He knew the names of the households upon his round in the ordinary way of a man of his calling, and he knew the small ways of the front doors along his route, and he knew which of the tall stucco houses opened at the first ring of the bell, and which required a second, and he passed each morning and each afternoon along the same familiar pavements with the plain honest attention his service required. He carried the small letters of the age in the front of his bag, tied in careful bundles by the sorting men within the office, and he carried the small brown parcels of the age in the deeper pocket at the bottom of the bag, laid carefully one upon another, so that no seal might be broken by the ordinary movement of his walk. His round took him along the promenade and up along the streets that climbed toward the higher terraces, and it took him into the smaller lanes behind the King's Road, and it brought him at last, each afternoon, to a small handful of the finer addresses upon which the gentle households of the season had gathered. In an upstairs room upon Gloucester Place, Above the polished top of a small writing desk, beneath a tall window, the small pile of pale, thick envelopes had grown steadily through the long, quiet afternoons of the season, and each envelope now carried upon its front, in the same careful gloved hand, the address of a respectable house upon one of the more polite streets of the town. The addresses had been chosen with the plain patient care of a mind long used to arranging small matters upon paper, and they were the addresses of ladies whose names appeared regularly in the visiting columns of the drawing-rooms, and they were the addresses of the wives of doctors, and of clergymen, and of gentlemen of good standing, and among them, quiet and small, in the middle of the pile, sat the address of a tall stucco house that stood only a few streets from the office of a certain physician upon Grand Parade. Each envelope had been sealed, with a small drop of red wax pressed firmly beneath a plain, unmarked ring, and each envelope held within it a small paper twist of chocolate cream wrapped carefully upon its dark glossy surface, and no letter of explanation had been folded inside the paper, and no card had been slipped beneath the string, and no plain name of a sender was set anywhere upon the outside of the wrapping. The pile was tied at last with a length of pale ribbon, and the gloved hand that had arranged it lifted the whole small bundle from the polished desk and carried it downstairs upon a still summer morning, and the front door of the boarding establishment upon Gloucester Place opened and closed with the soft, steady click of a lock. The landlady had long grown used to hearing. The pillar-boxes of Brighton stood at their appointed corners along the streets of the town, and they were painted in the deep red of the postal service, and their tall iron bodies caught the summer light in a long, quiet gleam. A gloved hand lifted the small brass flap of one such box upon a quiet corner of the front, and the small parcels of the pile were slipped one by one into the dark waiting mouth within, and the flap fell back into its place with the small metallic click the age knew well, and the pale morning street held no witness beyond the turn of a gull upon the roof-line above. The whole small work of many long quiet afternoons at a polished writing desk was completed in the space of a few short minutes upon the pavement outside the pillar-box, and the gloved hand that had done the work folded itself back into the pocket of a plain dark walking-coat, and the woman upon the pavement turned her step calmly along the front toward the promenade, and the small clock of a church tower struck the hour of the middle morning across the roof-line of the town. The sorting men within the tall stone office received the small parcels of the pillar-box in the ordinary way of their service, and their gloved hands moved the pieces along the polished counters and into their correct pigeonholes with the quick, unthinking skill of long practice, and no man among them lifted the small brown parcels for any longer than the ordinary handling of his work required. The postmen of the afternoon round took the pieces from the pigeonholes into the leather bags upon their shoulders, in the plain, honest way of the century, and they stepped out from the tall front door of the office into the wide summer light of the streets with the same steady walk they had brought to their calling for many years. The round of the afternoon carried them along the promenade and up through the small lanes behind the King's Road, and it took them at last to the polished doors of the finer households of the town, and the small bells of those doors rang in the plain quiet way they had rung upon every ordinary summer afternoon of the age. In one house and then in another, the housekeeper opened the front door to the postman upon his round, and the small brown parcel was laid down upon the polished silver tray of the hallway, and the housekeeper thanked the postman with the plain, polite word of her calling, and the polished front door closed once more upon the wide, bright afternoon of the season. The parcels lay upon their silver trays in the hallways of the finer houses for the small ordinary interval that such parcels lay in every hallway of the age, and the ladies of the households came down in due course in the middle hours of the afternoon, and lifted the small brown pieces in their pale gloved hands, and looked with a small quiet curiosity at the addresses upon the front. No name of a sender had been set upon any of the wrappings, and no return address was written upon the back of any envelope, and the small pale ribbon of the outer bundle had been undone in the sorting office, and each parcel now travelled alone. In more than one drawing-room upon that summer afternoon, a lady in a light shawl lifted the small brown paper of her parcel, and untied its length of thin string with the careful fingers of her upbringing, and she opened the pale twist within, and looked down upon a small heap of dark, glossy chocolate cream, lying calmly upon its paper. She smiled a little into the quiet of her drawing-room at the small kindness of an unknown friend, and she lifted the tray of her afternoon tea from the low table beside her chair, and she set the small pale twist of chocolate cream upon the china plate beside her biscuits and her small silver spoon. In one such drawing-room upon that afternoon, a lady of good standing offered the sweet from the plate to her small daughter, who had come down from the nursery upon the arm of her nurse for the middle hour of the day, and the child took one of the small dark squares in her mittened hand and lifted it slowly to her lips. In another such drawing-room, a lady lifted the sweet to her own mouth, in the quiet way of a woman comforting herself in the middle of a long summer afternoon, and she chewed for a moment upon the dark, glossy square, and paused, and her face made a small movement of surprise at the taste. In a third such drawing-room, a lady set the sweet gently aside upon the edge of her china plate, for the taste upon the first small bite had not been the plain taste she had expected, and she took up her cup of tea instead, and looked out upon the wide bright afternoon of the front. Within the space of the following hour, in more than one house upon more than one polite street of the town, small pale bells were rung for maidservants, and small basins were fetched from kitchen shelves, and the pale doors of upstairs rooms were closed upon the quiet trouble of ladies who had begun to feel a heaviness they could not easily name. The doctors of Brighton were called out from their consulting rooms upon Grand Parade, and upon Old Stein, and upon the smaller streets of the town in the plain ordinary way of the calling, and their leather bags were carried in their steady hands along the pavements of the front, and their gloved knocks fell upon the polished doors of more than one fine house of the season. In the drawing-rooms and in the small upstairs bedrooms of these households, the doctors bent over their patients with the calm, careful attention their profession required, and they asked their small even questions of the servants and of the family, and they wrote their notes in the leather books at their elbows in the plain, small letters of the age. The word chocolate began to be spoken in the quiet doorways of these houses in the low, careful voices of the calling, and the small, pale twists of paper were lifted from the china plates and set aside upon the mantels of the drawing-rooms, for the closer look of a later day. None of the ladies who had taken these small parcels died in the manner of the small boy in the parlour behind the King's Road, and each of them, in due course, rose again from the pale doors of their upstairs rooms into the warm summer light of their own drawing-rooms. But the shape of what had come into their houses upon the trays of their hallways was a shape none of them had yet learned to name. The physician upon Grand Parade, Dr. Charles Beard, was called in the middle days of that season to the bedside of a lady of his own acquaintance, whose house stood only a few streets from his own, and whose parcel had arrived by the ordinary afternoon round of the postman upon a plain summer day. He bent over the pale bedspread of the upstairs room with the same calm, even attention he had brought to every case of his round, and he wrote in the leather book at his elbow the small, even notes his office required, and he spoke to the family in the low, steady voice of his calling. Yet upon the small, polished mantel of the drawing-room downstairs, the pale twist of paper that had come with the afternoon post lay open in the quiet summer light, and the small, dark squares of chocolate cream within it caught the low, steady lamp of the room in a thin, silent gleam, and the good doctor, in the plain, honest habit of his mind, could not help but hold the small paper in his gloved hand, a shade longer than his round required. He looked at the address upon the front of the envelope in the careful, measured way of a man who had begun to see a shape he did not yet wish to see, and the small, even letters of the ink upon the pale, thick paper caught the summer light in a line that was already familiar to him, though he did not, in that first quiet moment, allow the plain thought of it to rise fully to the front of his mind. Beyond the tall window of the drawing-room, the wide, bright afternoon of the front went on in the plain, steady way of the season, and the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls upon the promenade lifted in the warm sea wind, and the small children of the town ran laughing along the shingle at low water, and the gulls turned white and clear above the pale roofs of the terraces. Somewhere along the streets of the town, the postman in his dark uniform walked his ordinary evening round with the leather bag hung upon his shoulder, and his boots rang upon the wet stones of the pavement in the plain steady rhythm of his service. Upon a polished silver tray in a hallway of another polite address, a small brown parcel lay waiting in the low warm light of the summer evening, and above it the pale doorway of a drawing-room stood softly open, and within the drawing-room a lady in a light shawl set down her cup upon the table beside her, and rose slowly from her chair, and she stepped along the carpet toward the hallway with her gloved hand already lifting toward the small brown paper upon the tray. The trap at the Old Bailey. The autumn came down slow upon Brighton in the closing months of the year, and the bright blue of the summer sea gave way once more to the grey slate of the colder season, and the long chalk cliffs above the town stood pale and unmoving against a sky that had grown low and heavy with the weight of the changing year. The gulls turned above the roofs of the terraces in wider, slower arcs, and their cries came thinner across the promenade in the cold, clear air of the mornings. and the striped awnings of the refreshment stalls had been folded away for another season and stored in the small back rooms of their owners. Along the front, the visitors of the summer had gone home to their inland towns upon the long trains that ran up through the Weald of Kent and along the older lines toward London, and the boarding houses of Gloucester Place and Marine Parade had grown quiet once more in the plain, slow rhythm of the winter months. The gas lamps of the town were lit a little earlier each evening as the days drew in, and the pale yellow flowers of their light bloomed one by one along the wet stones of the streets, and the sea fog moved once more in slow curling ribbons through the pools of that light at the fall of dusk. The century that held the town had settled again into its darker face, and the small parcels that had passed from gloved hand to gloved hand upon the polished silver trays of the summer had left behind them a quiet unease that no autumn wind had yet lifted from the finer streets of the front. The doctors of Brighton had gathered in the small back rooms of their calling through the late weeks of the summer and into the early weeks of the autumn, and they had spoken among themselves in the low, earnest voices of men whose profession had begun to see a plain shape it could no longer easily overlook. The small pale twists of paper had been laid upon the polished tables of these back rooms with a careful attention the age gave to any matter of the calling, and the dark glossy squares of chocolate cream within had been sent along to the plain quiet rooms of a chemist in London, whose skill in such matters was known across the kingdom. The word of that chemist had come back within the passing of only a few short weeks, and the word was plain and honest and terrible, and the poison called strychnine had been found within more than one of the small dark squares of the trays of the summer. The doctors of the town read the report in the low steady light of their consulting rooms, and they folded the pale paper away into the drawers of their desks, and they wrote small polite letters to the constables of the town setting out for them the plain shape of what their calling had at last understood. The report did not name any hand, and it did not name any shop, and it did not name any shop, and it did not name any street, and yet it laid its plain weight upon every desk it reached, with the quiet finality of a stone set down upon a pale linen cloth. Dr. Charles Beard, upon his own reading of the plain word from London, sat for a long while at the mahogany desk of his consulting room upon Grand Parade, and his gloved hand rested upon the leather blotter before him, and his eyes moved slowly to the small pile of pale, thick envelopes he had kept these many months in the locked drawer at his elbow. He had known, in the quieter country of his own mind, since the middle days of the summer, and he had held the small quiet thought at the back of his thinking through many long afternoons of his round, and now the plain honest word from London had lifted the small quiet thought into the full light of the desk lamp. He did not, in the plain honest way of his calling, wish to lay the shape of what he had understood upon the paper of any letter, and he did not, in the plain honest way of his calling, wish to speak the shape of it aloud within the walls of his own house, where his wife and his small children moved through the ordinary hours of the day. Yet the plain word from London had settled its weight upon the leather blotter of his desk, and he could not any longer set the weight aside, and upon a certain grey afternoon of the closing autumn, he lifted his coat from the stand beside the door, and walked in the slow measured step of his calling along the wet flags of Grand Parade toward the small stone office of the chief constable of the town. The office of the chief constable stood upon a quiet corner of the older part of the town, and its narrow front carried above the door the plain painted board of the Borough Police, and its front hall was furnished with the small plain benches of an office that received the ordinary complaints of every class of the town. A constable in the sober blue uniform of his calling led the good doctor along a panelled passage to a small back room, and the chief constable himself rose from behind his oak desk to receive the visitor with the grave polite courtesy the town reserved for men of the medical calling. The doctor set down upon the oak desk the small pile of pale thick envelopes he had carried in the deep pocket of his coat, and he set down beside them the plain report from the chemist in London, and he told the chief constable, in the low, even voice of a man who had thought long upon what he was about to say, the shape of the matter as he had come to understand it. The chief constable listened without interruption in the plain, patient way of his office, and he wrote small even notes in the leather book at his elbow, and when the doctor had finished the plain shape of his account, the two men sat for a long quiet moment across the oak desk, without speaking a word. From that grey afternoon onward, the investigation moved through the streets of the town in the slow, patient step of the plain police work of the age, and the constables of the borough walked their small, careful rounds among the shops of West Street and among the boarding houses of the front, and they spoke in low, even voices with the errand boys, and with the shop assistants and with the housekeepers of every polite address that had received a small brown parcel by the summer post. The leather book of the chemist, Isaac Garrett, was carried away from the dim little shop upon West Street, and laid open upon the oak desk of the chief constable, and the small even lines of ink upon its pages were read slowly and carefully in the low steady light of the office lamp. The names within the book had been the ordinary names of respectable purchasers of the town, and the witnesses beside them had been the ordinary names of neighbours of good standing, and yet upon the careful patient reading of the plain lines, small quiet questions began to rise within the mind of the chief constable that the plain lines could not easily answer. An errand boy pulled from the pavement outside the shop upon a certain grey afternoon of the earlier year was found within the working streets of the town, and he was brought to the small back room of the office, and he told, in the plain honest voice of a boy of his age, the small honest account of the note that had been handed to him, and of the coin that had been laid into his arm, and of the gloved hand upon the wet pavement that had received the small brown packet at the end of his errand. The word of a lady in a plain dark walking coat began, in the slow patient way of the plain police work of the age, to move through the small even notes of the leather book upon the chief constable's desk, and the small quiet shape of that lady began to gather, beneath the pen of the office in the plain lines of the age. She was not named at once, and she was not sought at once, and the plain patient step of the calling did not lift itself into any hurried motion, and the constables of the borough went on with their small careful rounds through the closing weeks of the autumn, and into the first cold weeks of the winter. Yet the plain shape of the lady grew steadily upon the pages of the book, and the small even notes gathered themselves into a fuller picture, and upon a certain cold morning of the middle winter, the chief constable folded the leather book beneath his arm, and stepped out from the small stone office into the grey light of the street, and he walked in the plain, measured step of his calling, along the wet flags of the town, toward the certain quiet boarding-house upon Gloucester Place. The small formal business of that cold morning was conducted in the plain sober language the age preferred, and the elder lady of the household was addressed with the grave courtesy her class required, and the elder daughter of the household was asked, in the low even voice of the office, to accompany the constables upon a small matter that required her attention within the walls of the borough hall. She rose from her seat in the small parlour of the boarding-house in the plain quiet manner of her upbringing, and she tied her plain dark bonnet close beneath her chin, in the same careful way she had tied it upon so many other mornings of the past long year, and she stepped out from the polished front door of the boarding-house upon Gloucester Place, upon the arm of the chief constable in the plain, steady step of a lady of her class. The wide grey channel moved slowly beyond the iron railings of the promenade, and the sea wind carried the taste of salt across the wet flags of the pavement, and a gull turned above the pale roofs of the terraces with the same slow patient wings it had turned upon every morning of the season. The plain small hearing before the magistrates of the town was held within the polished oak walls of the borough hall upon a cold winter morning, and the papers of the coroner and the leather book of the chemist and the small pile of pale thick envelopes lay together upon the oak table before the bench. The magistrates of the borough sat in the plain sober robes of their office, and they listened without interruption to the plain even accounts of the constables and of the doctors, and of the errand boy pulled from the pavement of West Street, and they wrote small even notes in the leather books at their elbows. Upon the closing of the plain small hearing, the magistrate spoke to the lady in the plain dark bonnet in the grave courteous voice their office required, and they set out for her the plain shape of the matter as the borough had come to understand it, and they committed her, in the plain measured phrase of the age, to stand her trial upon the graver bench of the central criminal court of the kingdom in the city of London. The train from the coast to the great capital of the age ran up through the wet green weald of Kent in the middle days of the winter, and the low grey sky moved above the small wooden carriages in the plain. Slow way of the season, within one of the plain locked carriages of the train, the lady in the plain dark bonnet sat between two constables of the borough in the sober blue uniforms of their calling, and her gloved hands were folded very quietly in her lap, and her pale eyes rested upon the passing hedges of the county, without any small movement of surprise. The train ran on through the small country stations of Kent and into the wider outskirts of the great city, and the tall chimneys of the northern suburbs rose one by one against the low grey sky, and the small carriages of the line drew at last into the great glass and iron shed of the London terminus in the middle hours of a cold winter afternoon. The central criminal court of the kingdom stood upon a corner of the older part of the great city, and its plain stone front carried above its heavy doors the painted words of its office, in the plain letters the age preferred. The heavy oak benches within its long courtroom had been polished by the patient hands of 100 small keepers over the passing of many long years, and the tall dark panelling of its walls rose in careful measured lines toward the low painted ceiling above. The reporters of the great papers of the age had already gathered in their plain wooden gallery at the back of the courtroom by the morning of the trial, and their notebooks were opened upon their knees, and their pencils were sharpened in the plain careful way of the calling, and their eyes rested with a quiet careful attention upon the small enclosed dock at the front of the room. The papers of the age had, in the weeks before the trial, tried in their plain columns to set down for their readers the shape of the lady from the coast, and their words had moved uneasily upon the pale thick sheets of their morning editions, and they had reached for one careful phrase after another, without ever quite closing their hand upon the plain thing they had come to describe. She was a lady of the professional class, they wrote, and she was of gentle upbringing and of respectable connections, and she was of the age that the century called neither young nor old, and she was of a pale, quiet appearance that no reader of the papers might easily have marked upon the pavement of any front. The papers wrote of her in the plain, careful language of the age, and they could not, in that language, quite hold the shape of what she had done within the plain sentences of their columns, and their words moved on through the small morning pages in a slow, uneasy hush. In the reading rooms of the clubs and in the tea rooms of the finer streets, gentlemen lifted the papers in their gloved hands and set them down again without any small comfortable remark, for the shape upon the page was not a shape. Their century had a settled word for, and the plain silence at the tables was the truest reading. The age could give. Within the great courtroom itself, upon the morning of the plain sober trial, the heavy oak benches began to fill in the slow patient way of the age, and the plain gentlemen of the London bar, in their dark gowns and their small white wigs, moved to their appointed places at the long tables below the bench, and the plain gentlemen of the jury took their seats within their small enclosed box, along the far wall. The judge of the day entered from a small panelled door behind the bench in the plain slow step of his office, and the whole long room rose to its feet in the grave respectful hush of the calling, and the judge took his seat in the tall carved chair beneath the painted arms of the crown. Upon the small enclosed dock at the front of the room, a plain wooden gate was opened by the keeper of the court, and the lady in the plain dark bonnet was led forward from the small passage behind, and she took her place in the dock in the plain steady step of her upbringing, and she folded her gloved hands very quietly upon the wooden rail before her. The clerk of the court rose from his small desk beneath the bench, and he lifted the plain long parchment of the age from the polished wood before him, and he began to read out, in the slow, even voice of his calling, the plain formal words that the century used to open a trial of such a kind. The plain formal words that the century used to open a trial of such a kind. The reporters in the gallery bent low over the small pages of their notebooks, and their pencils moved in the plain careful lines of their trade, and the jury within their small enclosed box turned their eyes toward the dock in the plain steady attention their office required. Outside the tall painted windows of the courtroom, the great city moved on through the middle hours of the cold winter morning, and the plain grey sky lay low above the roofs of the older lanes, and a cart rolled slowly past upon the wet stones of the street below, and the low bell of a distant church struck the hour of 11 across the pale roofline of the city. Broadmoor and the long silence. The verdict came down upon the great courtroom in the plain, sober phrase, "The age preferred," and the 12 gentlemen of the jury returned from their small enclosed room in the middle hours of the winter afternoon, and the foreman of their number rose in the plain, steady step of his office, and gave to the bench the plain word of their finding. She was guilty of the charge that had been laid against her, they said, and yet she was, in the plain, careful language of the century, not sound in her mind at the time of the doing, and the long, slow shape of that phrase carried within it the whole quiet weight of what the 12 men had come to believe. The judge upon the tall carved bench received the word of the foreman in the grave, measured manner his office required, and he set down his pen upon the leather blotter before him, and he spoke into the long hush of the courtroom the plain formal sentence the century used for such a case, and his voice moved slowly beneath the painted arms of the crown above his head. The lady in the plain dark bonnet stood very quietly within the small enclosed dock at the front of the room while the sentence was read, and her gloved hands rested upon the wooden rail before her, in the same careful manner they had rested there throughout the passing days of the trial, and her pale eyes did not lift toward the bench above her, nor drop toward the polished floor below. The keeper of the court opened the plain wooden gate of the dock at the closing of the plain formal words, and she was led away along the small panelled passage behind, and the heavy oak door closed softly upon her back, and the reporters in the plain wooden gallery bent low once more over the small pages of their notebooks and wrote the plain word of the ending in the careful lines of their trade. Beyond the tall painted windows of the courtroom, the great city moved on through the closing hours of the cold winter afternoon, and the pale grey sky lay low above the roofs of the older lanes, and a lamplighter walked slowly along a nearby street with his long pole in his gloved hand, and the small blue flowers of the evening gas began to bloom one by one along the wet stones of the pavement. The place to which he was in due course carried lay some 30 miles to the west of the great city, upon a low wooded ridge within the quiet county of Berkshire, and its plain name was set down in the ledgers of the age as Broadmoor. The great walled house had been raised only some few years before her coming, upon the design of an engineer of the crown, and it stood upon its ridge in the plain red brick of its century, with tall barred windows set into its long even walls, and a high enclosing wall and a high enclosing wall of the same red brick running around the whole of its grounds. The countryside about it was of the plain, gentle sort the southern counties of England had long been known for, with wide fields of pale wheat in the warmer months and low woods of oak and beech upon the surrounding hills, and small quiet villages of thatched cottages scattered among the winding lanes. The nearest small settlement was a place called Crowthorne, and its plain narrow street ran between a handful of low cottages and a small stone church, and the working people of the village came and went along its pavement in the plain ordinary way of country folk who lived within sight of a great walled house, whose business they had learned not to speak of aloud. The train from the great city to the quiet county ran up through the western suburbs upon a plain winter afternoon, and its small wooden carriages moved slowly past the tall chimneys of the outer streets and out into the low grey fields beyond, and the pale sky lay heavy above the passing hedges. Within one of the plain locked carriages of the train, the lady in the plain dark bonnet sat between two attendants of the asylum in the sober grey uniforms of their calling, and her gloved hands were folded very quietly in her lap, and her pale eyes rested upon the passing hedges of the county without any small movement of surprise. The train drew at last into a small country station upon the closing of the winter afternoon, and a plain closed carriage stood waiting upon the frosted stones of the yard beyond the platform, and the small party of attendants stepped down from the wooden carriage and crossed to the door of the closed vehicle in the plain steady step of their calling. The horses moved forward at the touch of the reins, and the small closed carriage rolled out along the frozen lane beyond the station in the plain. Slow rhythm of the age, and the pale winter light thinned upon the fields to either side, and the low bare branches of the roadside trees passed one by one across the small square window of the door. The gates of the great walled house stood at the far end of a long climbing lane, and they were of heavy iron painted the deep dark green of the crown, and they opened at the ringing of a plain bell by a keeper in the sober grey uniform of the asylum, and the small closed carriage passed beneath the tall red brick arch of the gatehouse, and rolled slowly into the wide gravel courtyard within. The great walled house rose above the courtyard in its long even lines of red brick, and its tall barred windows caught the last thin light of the winter afternoon in a low steady gleam, and the wide gravel of the yard stretched out cold and pale beneath the plain iron lamps that had already been lit for the coming of the evening. She was led down from the small closed carriage in the plain steady step of a lady of her upbringing, and she was taken along a plain stone passage into the small receiving room of the asylum, and the plain heavy door closed softly upon her back, and the plain iron lock turned once within its casing in the low quiet air of the corridor. The receiving room was of the plain sober sort, the age preferred for such a place, and its walls were of pale distempered plaster, and its floor was of dark polished boards, and a single tall barred window looked out upon the winter courtyard beyond. A plain deal table stood in the middle of the room, and upon it lay the leather book of the house in which the names of every new inmate were set down in the small even letters of the office, and a keeper in the sober grey uniform of the calling took the pen from the small brass stand beside the book, and wrote her name in the plain careful hand the age required. Her plain dark bonnet was untied from beneath her chin, and her plain dark coat was lifted from her shoulders, and the small pearl brooch at her throat was unpinned, and laid upon the deal table beside the leather book, and the plain grey dress of the house was brought in upon the arm of an attendant, and laid across the polished wood. The plain small ceremony of her admission was completed in the plain quiet hush of the winter evening, and she was led along another plain stone passage to the small quiet chamber that had been made ready for her, and the plain heavy door closed softly upon her back, and the small chamber held her within its plain pale walls in the low steady light of a single oil lamp. The chamber was of the plain, sober sort, the age preferred for the female wing of such a house, and its walls were of pale distempered plaster, and its floor was of dark polished boards, and a plain iron bedstead stood along one wall with a plain white counterpane laid across it, and a small deal table stood beneath a tall barred window that looked out upon the winter garden below. The garden beyond the tall barred window lay very quiet in the closing of the winter afternoon, and its plain gravel paths ran between low bare beds of frozen earth, and its plain wooden benches stood empty in the pale thin light, and the high red brick wall enclosed the whole of it in a long unbroken line beneath the low grey sky. The days within the great walled house moved in the plain steady rhythm the century had chosen for such a place, and the plain bell of the asylum rang at the same hour each morning to call the inmates from their chambers, and the same bell rang again at the same hour each evening to send them back within their doors. The meals of the house were taken in a long plain hall beneath a low white ceiling, and the plain wooden tables were set out in careful even rows, and the plain enamel plates were laid upon them in the same careful even manner at each hour of the day, and the plain grey dresses of the female wing moved between them in the low steady hush of the calling. The work of the house was of the plain gentle sort, the age thought suitable for ladies of her class, and small pieces of fine sewing were laid out upon the deal tables of the day-room, and small books of plain devotion were opened upon the polished wood, and small vases of common flowers stood upon the sideboards in the warmer months of the year. She sat among the other ladies of the female wing in the plain small chair the house had given her, and her gloved hands moved upon the small pieces of fine sewing in the same careful even rhythm. They had moved upon the fine sewing of her girlhood, and her pale eyes rested upon the plain even lines of her stitching without any small movement of surprise. The physicians of the great walled house came and went along the plain stone passages in the sober dark coats of their calling, and they carried the leather books of their office beneath their arms, and they wrote the small even notes of their profession in the plain. Small letters the age preferred. They stopped at her chamber door upon the ordinary rounds of the morning, and they asked her, in the plain even voice of the calling, after the small ordinary matters of her sleeping and her eating and her sewing, and she answered them in the plain low voice of her upbringing, with the plain small words of her upbringing, with the plain small words of a lady who had been taught in her girlhood how to speak to a physician upon the pavement of Grand Parade. The plain small notes upon her page in the leather book of the house grew slowly through the plain steady passing of the winter months, and into the plain steady passing of the spring, and the small even letters of the ink laid down upon the pale thick paper, the plain shape of her days. The seasons of Berkshire moved above the tall red brick walls of the great house in the plain. Patient way of the southern counties and the pale wheat of the surrounding fields grew slowly through the long warm months of the summer, and the low woods of oak and beech upon the surrounding hills turned in the closing months of the autumn to the deep bronze and gold of their year. Beyond the tall barred window of her plain small chamber, the winter garden gave way in due course to the plain green beds of the spring, and the plain wooden benches of the gravel paths were sat upon once more in the warmer months of the year by the ladies of the female wing in their plain grey dresses, and the small common flowers of the summer bloomed in the plain low rows of the ordinary garden of the house. She walked among these low rows of the garden upon the ordinary afternoons of the warmer months, and her plain grey dress moved upon the plain gravel of the paths in the same slow even step it had moved upon the polished flags of Grand Parade in the earlier years of her life, and her plain gloved hands were folded very quietly at her waist as she walked. The keepers of the female wing walked at a small distance behind her in the sober grey uniforms of their calling, and their plain patient eyes rested upon her back in the plain steady attention their office required, and their plain leather books were carried in the deep pockets of their coats for the small even notes of the day. The years of her life within the great walled place moved slowly through the closing of one century and into the opening of another, and the plain quiet news of the outside world came in only in the plain. Small letters of the outside world came in only in the plain. Small letters of the age carried by the postman to the plain, heavy gates of the gatehouse. In the plain sober rooms of the physician's hall, the leather books of her page grew thick upon the polished shelves, and the small even notes of the ink laid down the plain, small shape of her many quiet years, and the plain word of any small change in her calm even manner was set down in the plain careful letters of the calling. Her mother, in the plain small rooms of the boarding-house upon Gloucester Place, did not come to visit her in the plain sober corridors of the great walled house, and no small letter in the careful gloved hand of the elder lady was carried by the postman through the plain heavy gates of the gatehouse. She did not, through the long passing of the ordinary hours, lift her voice against the plain steady rhythm of the day, and she did not turn her plain gloved hands against the plain small pieces of fine sewing laid before her upon the deal tables of the day-room. Only upon the plain still nights of the long winter months, when the low bell of the house had rung its evening hour, and the plain heavy doors of the chambers had been locked one by one upon their long even passages, did the plain quiet air of her small chamber sometimes carry the low even sound of a woman speaking softly to herself in the dark, and the plain keepers of the corridor walked slowly past her door in the sober patient step of their calling, and did not open the lock. The century of her girlhood passed at last into the plain low pages of the older histories, and a new century opened above the tall red brick walls of the great walled house, and the plain sober coats of the physicians of the calling gave way to the plain sober coats of a younger generation, and the plain leather books of her page were carried down from the polished shelves and set upon the plain deal tables of the newer hall. The plain small notes of the later letters of the calling described her, in the plain careful language of the age, as a lady of great age and of quiet plain habit, and the plain small pearl of her hair beneath the plain grey cap of the house had by now turned to the plain soft white of a lady of her many years. She had by this time entered the closing years of her long life within the plain quiet corridors of the great walled house, and the plain small chamber upon the long even passage had been hers for very nearly the whole of a working lifetime of the age, and the small deal table beneath the tall barred window had held the plain small pieces of her fine sewing through the plain patient passing of every season of the years. Upon a plain grey afternoon of the closing autumn of the year 1907, the plain small keeper of the female wing entered the plain quiet chamber upon the long even passage in the ordinary way of the calling, and she found the lady of the plain small chair at the deal table beneath the tall barred window in the plain steady quiet of the closing hour. The small piece of fine sewing lay folded upon the polished wood before her, and the plain gloved hands were folded very quietly upon the grey lap of the dress of the house, and the pale eyes were closed upon the low thin light of the autumn afternoon, and the small chamber held her within its plain pale walls in the plain quiet hush of the ending. She was of the age of 78 years upon the day of her passing within the plain quiet corridors of the great walled house, and she had been within its plain red brick walls for the space of some 35 years of the age, and the plain small keepers of the female wing carried her plain grey dress from the small chair at the deal table upon the plain steady step of their calling. Her plain small grave was dug within the plain quiet enclosure of the burial ground of the house, upon the low wooded ridge within the quiet county of Berkshire, and the plain small stone that was set at the head of it carried in the small letters of the age only the letters of her name and the plain small dates of her birth and her ending. Beyond the tall red brick walls of the great walled house, the low woods of oak and beech upon the surrounding hills turned in the plain, patient way of every autumn of the age, and the pale wheat of the surrounding fields had already been carried in from the last harvest of the year, and the plain low sky lay heavy above the wooded ridge in the plain, steady way of the closing season. The plain small news of her passing did not carry far beyond the plain heavy gates of the gatehouse, and the papers of the great city did not lift their columns to the plain. Small notice of the ending, and the plain quiet corridors of the female wing moved on in the plain steady rhythm of the ordinary hours, in the plain patient way of every day of the many long years. Within the plain small burial ground upon the low wooded ridge, the plain grey stone at the head of her grave stood in the low thin light of the autumn afternoon, and the plain small letters of her name and her dates caught the low light in a quiet even line, and the wind of the season moved slowly through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. The sea returns to Brighton. The years that followed her plain small grave upon the low wooded ridge moved on above the town of Brighton in the plain patient way of the southern coast, and the tide came in and went out upon the shingle in the same steady rhythm it had always kept, and the wide grey channel lay beyond the iron railings of the promenade, as though nothing at all had passed within the walls of the great red brick house in the distant county to the west. The gas lamps of the town burned on along the wet stones of the streets for a long while after her name had fallen from the pages of the papers, and the small blue flowers of their evening light still bloomed, one by one, at the touch of the lamplighter's long pole through the closing years of the older century. In due course the plain iron lamps of the front gave way to the newer light of a later age, and the pale glow along the promenade grew steadier and whiter than the old gas had ever been, and the sea fog moved through the pools of that newer light in the same slow curling ribbons it had always moved through the older kind. The bath chairs of the earlier season went quietly out of use in the closing years of the older century, and the striped awnings of the small refreshment stalls were folded away at last for a final winter, and the small painted signs of the older shops upon West Street were taken down one by one from their iron brackets in the plain, slow way the age gave up its familiar shapes. The polished door of G. Owl lot one engine. Maynard the confectioner closed for the last time upon the sweet trade of West Street in the plain quiet passing of the years, and the tall glass jars of the front window were carried away into the back rooms of other shops, and the small brass scales of the counter were laid at last upon the shelves of a country museum in another part of the county. The chemist Isaac Garrett kept his dim little shop along the same street for a season longer than the confectioner did, and the leather book of his counter passed at last into the plain records of the borough, and the small locked drawer of his dark wooden cabinet was emptied of the small brown bottles of its trade and carried away into the plain quiet keeping of the calling. The tall stucco terraces of the front were painted and repainted in the soft creams and pale greys of the passing generations, and the small bow windows of the older lanes were replaced in due course by the plainer panes of a newer trade, and the small handsome carriages that once rolled along the road behind the walkers of the promenade gave way at last to the plain sober motor cars of a later season. 2 great wars passed above the roofs of the town in the closing of one age and the opening of another, and the men of Brighton went away upon the long trains of the Northern Line and did not, in many small households of the front, return again, and the plain quiet grief of those years settled softly upon the polished sideboards of the drawing-rooms in the plain old manner of the age. The old West Pier that had stretched out beyond the shingle upon its long iron legs in the days of the horsehair sofa and the ceiling lamp was closed at last in the closing of the older century, and the sea took it slowly in the plain patient rhythm of the coast, and its dark iron frame stands today as a quiet ruin above the water, holding the pale sky within the small empty squares of its bones. The other pier, the Palace Pier of the newer age, stretches out today upon the same wide grey channel but has always moved against the shingle, and its long boards carry in the summer months the small children of a newer generation, and their laughter rises above the water in the plain honest voice of every child who has ever run along a pier upon a warm afternoon of the season. The promenade still runs along the front of the sea in the same long careful line, the older century laid down, and its iron railings still stand black and firm against the spray, and the pale flags of its pavement still catch the low bright silver of the Channel light upon the clear afternoons of the year. The chalk of the South Downs still rises above the town in the plain slow curves of the older maps, and the pale cliffs still stand along the coast to the east and the west in the same quiet unmoving line, and the gulls still turn white and clear above the roofs of the terraces in the wide open sky of the season. The royal pavilion of the older kings still keeps its plain painted domes above the wide green space of the Stein, and the small paths of the older gardens still run between its low walls in the plain quiet way of the earlier years, and the visitors of a newer age still walk beneath its arches upon the warm summer afternoons of the coast. The street called Grand Parade still runs along the eastern side of the older part of the town, and the plain flags of its pavement still lie in the same broad grey squares, and the tall front windows of its terraces still catch the low winter light of the sea in the same long quiet panels they caught in the days of a certain doctor of the calling. Number 64 upon that same street still stands within the long even line of the older houses, and the plain brass plate of the earlier calling is long gone from beside its polished door, and the small room behind that door has been changed, and changed again through the passing of the many years, and no small trace of the mahogany desk or the tall cabinet of the polished instruments remains within its plain modern walls. Gloucester Place, where the plain boarding house of an elder lady and her elder daughter once stood, still runs in its plain quiet line only a short walk from the front, and the tall stucco houses of the older terrace still carry the pale gold light of the summer evenings upon their long even faces, and the small polished doorways still open and close in the ordinary way of a street of the town. The narrow slope of West Street still runs down toward the sea in the same long, careful line the older century laid down, and the shops upon it wear the plain modern faces of a newer trade, and the small confectioners of the older season are long gone from beneath the painted signs of the age. Yet upon the wet flags of the pavement, in the plain quiet hours of the winter mornings, a careful walker may still feel beneath the sole of a shoe the same soft slope of the older stones, and the plain sea wind still moves along the length of the street with the same taste of salt that carried across it upon a warm summer afternoon of 1871. The small terrace house behind the King's Road, where a little visitor from Kent was laid upon a horsehair sofa in the parlour on the 12th day of June of that older summer, has passed through the plain quiet hands of many small households in the years since the closing of the older century. The small round table in the middle of that parlour, and the plain black horsehair of the sofa along the wall, and the coal fire that burned low in the grate through the winter months, are long gone from within its plain modern rooms, and no small mark upon the polished floor remains today of the hour in which a doctor rose from his knee beside the sofa and turned to a father at the front window and spoke the plain gentle word of his profession. The great walled house upon the low wooded ridge within the quiet county of Berkshire still stands today above the small village of Crowthorne, and its long even lines of red brick still rise above the wide gravel of its inner courts, and its tall barred windows still catch the low thin light of the Berkshire afternoons in a long steady gleam. The small burial ground upon its ridge holds within its plain quiet enclosure the plain grey stones of many of the lost of the older age, and the wind of the season still moves slowly through the bare branches of the surrounding trees upon the closing afternoons of the autumn, and the low woods of oak and beech upon the surrounding hills still turn in the plain, patient way of every year. Somewhere within that plain quiet enclosure, beneath the low thin light of the autumn afternoons, lies the plain grey stone that carries in the small letters of the age, only the letters of a name and the plain small dates of a life, and the wind moves across those small letters in the same steady way it moves across every other stone of the ground. Yet the eulogy of this ending does not belong to the plain grey stone upon the low wooded ridge, and it does not belong to the great walled house within its long red brick lines, and it does not belong to any name that history has already lifted many times into the plain columns of its books. The eulogy of this ending belongs to a small boy in a white cotton shirt and a pair of dark blue short trousers, and it belongs to his mother who knelt at the side of a horsehair sofa on a warm summer afternoon of 1871 and held his small hand within both of hers and spoke his name gently into the quiet of a small terrace parlour behind the King's Road. His name was Sidney Albert Barker, and he was 4 years old, and he had come down upon the morning train from a village near Maidstone in the county of Kent, and he had stood at the iron railings of the promenade in the warm bright light of a summer afternoon and looked out for the first time upon a body of water larger than any village pond of his short life. He had walked the length of the promenade upon his father's finger, and he had stepped upon the long boards of the pier and looked down through the small gaps between the planks to the green water sliding far below, and he had pressed his small hands to the glass of a shop window upon West Street and asked in the plain honest voice of a child of his age whether he might have a sweet. He was given one square of dark chocolate cream from the pale paper twist opened upon the pavement outside the shop, and he was carried home in his father's arms along the streets behind the King's Road, and he was laid upon the horsehair sofa in the small terrace parlour of his uncle Charles David Miller, and he did not rise from the small cushions again. He is remembered here tonight, gently, and he is spoken of by his name, and no small stone in any burial ground of the age has ever quite held the plain honest weight of what was lost within the small parlour behind the King's Road upon the 12th day of June of that older summer. The other ladies of the finer streets of the town who lifted small dark squares of chocolate cream to their lips upon the polished china plates of the summer afternoons of 1871 are held in the plain patient records of the age in a quieter way than the small boy from Kent, for the plain honest word from the chemist in London and the calm careful hands of the doctors of Brighton lifted them in due course again from the pale doors of their upstairs rooms. Their small, quiet trouble was set down in the leather books of the calling, and their names were folded softly into the plain columns of the older papers, and the plain, sober records of the borough hold their small, quiet suffering in the plain, honest way of the age, and they are remembered here, quietly, in the plain, small line of the many who have carried a fear home upon a silver tray without ever asking to. the good confectioner John Maynard of West Street, who wore his plain white apron behind the polished counter of his shop through the many small, honest years of his trade, is remembered here also for the plain, steady honesty of his calling, and the plain, quiet chill that came upon his trade in the closing weeks of that summer, belonged to a shadow he did not bring upon his own polished door. The Dr. Charles Beard, who sat at the mahogany desk of his consulting room upon Grand Parade in the plain low light of a certain grey autumn afternoon, and lifted his coat from the stand beside the door, and walked at last to the small stone office of the chief constable of the town, is remembered here for the plain patient courage of the walk that carried him along the wet flags of the street upon that afternoon. His wife Emily Beard, who lifted the pale thick letters from the silver tray in her hallway through the long quiet afternoons of an earlier season, and did not know at first how to name the small unease that had entered her home, is remembered here also, quietly, for the plain patient burden she carried within the tall stucco walls of her small family house. Brighton stands today upon the same wide grey channel that has always moved against the shingle of its shore, and its promenade still runs along the front of the sea, in the same long careful line the older century laid down, and the salt wind still moves along the pale flags of the pavement in the same steady rhythm it moved upon the winter afternoons of 1870. The gulls still turn white and clear above the pale roofs of the terraces, and the chalk of the South Downs still rises in the plain slow curves of the older maps above the town, and the small children of a newer generation still run along the shingle at low water in the plain, honest voice of every child who has ever run along the shore of that sea. The candle of the older century has burned down long ago upon the plain quiet counters of the shops of West Street, and the small brass scales are gone from their polished wood, and the pale paper twists are folded away into the pale paper twists are folded away into the plain records of the age. The chamber of the great walled house upon the low wooded ridge is quiet now, and the small piece of fine sewing has been carried away from the deal table beneath the tall barred window, and the plain grey dress has been folded and laid at last into the plain, small drawer of the calling. The wide grey channel moves on beyond the iron railings of the promenade. The salt wind carries the small name of Sidney Albert Barker softly across the pale flags of the pavement, and the sea returns, as it has always returned, to Brighton in the dark,